All right, so before we start, whoa, a little loud. Before we start on the next sort of round of speakers, I'm just going to, some of you don't know about the history or the structure of the Center for Blood Research at UBC, so I thought I'd just give you a very, 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 very quick overview. So the origins come from the days when, oh, that didn't work. My viruses just jumped out of the bag. Let me try that again. It's really incredible what happens, huh? Let's try that again. How's that? Okay, and then try this. All right, pretty good, huh? All right, so when hepatitis and HIV infected the blood services and the blood supply, rather, of the blood service, the blood supply of in Canada and elsewhere in the world, and there was a commission that took place in the I guess in the 1990s, and there was a report by Justice Horace Creever, and at that time he. One of the recommendations, of which there were many and which had a huge impact on the formation of the Canadian Blood Services as we know it today, was to invest resources and money into research to prevent such disasters from occurring. And as a consequence, there was a money grab, to put it bluntly. Monies were made available from the provinces, from the federal government, and from various industry, and as well as organizations that had vested interest, including, say, the Heart and Stroke Foundation. And so some wise physicians, I'm really having a hard time here today. Dawn, you got mushed. But anyway, I'm going to try this again. Let's just do it this way. So 5 entrepreneurial type of investigators, and you can see them. These are our stem cells. These are our founders of the Center for Blood Research. That's Grant Mock. Ross McGilvery was the founding director. Chip Haynes, Don Brooks, and Dana, and some are here, but you know most of these people. And they really led a huge opportunity to create a multidisciplinary, it was a virtual institute. There was no building at the time, of about 35 investigators from primarily across UBC, but as well as the University of Victoria and Northern British Columbia, and covered a variety of disciplines, so across 5 faculties. And it's somewhat morphed now, so there are 40 principal investigators, including 6 clinicians or clinician investigators. It truly is multidisciplinary across 5 faculties. There are over 100 graduate students that are associated, over 100 postdocs, and a large number of clinical trainees. All the principal investigators are independently funded from other sources, so it's not a blood center like some that are in the States. But really, one of the major advantages is that it brings together multidisciplinary groups like this venue here. So here are our principal investigators. There you are, Ross, in happier days. leading the way. And then, of course, we're supported by Circulating Cells, which are all our students and trainees. And there's Ed Pryzel, who's the associate director, sporting something interesting. So then we're supported, these are our regulators of sorts and controllers. Anna Sanova, who's our education program manager, and Hannah Kim, who many of you know is our office manager. And these 2 individuals really make this place happen, and so they are to be thanked and credited with our ability to introduce many primarily education and training programs at UBC, at the Center for Blood Research, which cuts across from education, and it's a challenge because everybody comes from different disciplines, but to integrate this, to bring people together who have different interests, and to identify means in which they can interact, and then to develop opportunities in terms of career development. It's all very important to us. So over and above what they otherwise would get in the department. All focused really in 3 major areas: in hemostatic balance and transfusion medicine, as you've seen here, and inflammation and infection and wound healing and repair. So the training programs are extensive and comprehensive, from the summer student all the way to the postdoc and the research associate, and these are really spectacular, and I can't tell you how many different programs that are ongoing. The writing, those brochures that you see that have been distributed are all student-driven. I get to read them just before they're published, but I don't have much editing power there, so that's a disclaimer. But they're terrific articles, and the students put those together themselves. That is all supported, though, by our donors, because the university, in its wisdom, doesn't really provide us with much in the way of resources. So we raise those funds, and it comes from the generosity and the support of our sponsors. These are the ones today, and we have other ones as well as private individuals, and certainly government and other grants. Okay, so that's why we're here today. Now I can move on, and hopefully the slides will continue to work better. So our first speaker this afternoon is Jean Wang, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto, an affiliate scientist at Princess Margaret Cancer Centre. I just heard that it's changed its name back to almost what I used to know it as the Princess Margaret Hospital. And she's also a staff hematologist at the University Health Network, which used to be the Vancouver General Hospital, or the Toronto General Hospital. And so she's a staff hematologist there. And her research focuses on leukemia stem cell biology in acute myelogenous leukemia and testing the efficacy of novel anti-leukemic drugs and developing means of stratifying patients in the clinic. Except that's not why she's here. She is really here to tell us the history of blood, and I'm going to let Jean tell us why she fell into this little area, which is so intriguing and wonderful.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks. So can you hear me okay? So thanks very much for inviting me. I always like to talk about this subject, and you're probably wondering why a leukemia researcher is talking to you about the history of transfusion medicine, but I think it'll become apparent as I go through my talk. So I have a disclaimer slide. So first, I have no relevant financial disclosures, but my main disclosure is that I am a stamp collector. So here is the first stamp that was issued on blood donation. It was issued by Hungary in 1942. And over the years, there have been about maybe 200 stamps or so. So this is how I got interested in the history of transfusion medicine, through my collection and researching the background of these stamps. And I put stamp in parentheses here because once you're a collector, once you have that collecting bug, you tend to collect all kinds of things. So I've also, in addition to stamps, I have a collection of various printed materials related to the history of transfusion medicine, and I'll show you pictures of some of my collection during my talk. So today I'm going to give you just a brief tour of the history of transfusion medicine, just hit some of the highlights. I can't go into all the details because of the time, but we're going to start with some early attempts at blood transfusions, the discovery and implementation of blood groups, the major ABO blood groups, and then how the necessities of war influenced advances in the science of transfusion medicine. So we'll start. The credit for the first human transfusion is given to Jean-Baptiste Denis. So he was a professor of philosophy and mathematics at Montpellier and physician to Louis XIV of France. And in June of 1667, he transfused a young boy, 15 years old, with about 12 ounces of blood, this is about 340 cc's, from the carotid artery of a lamb into this boy's arm vein. And miraculously, the boy survived. So this was the very first time. And then Richard Lower, a few months later, who was an English physician and a member of the newly formed Royal Society, performed, as he says, in the presence of many considerable and intelligent persons, a similar transfusion. He transfused 9 to 10 ounces of sheep's blood into a mentally unstable Bachelor of Divinity named Arthur Koga. And they did this in order to cool his blood and restore order to his brain. Here's a Victorian trade card, which was an early form of collectible advertising that was very popular in the late 1800s. And from this company, this was from a series on medicine, and you can see on the back here a scene of a young woman being transfused with the blood of a goat. So these were, the first attempts at transfusing humans, all from animal blood, and not surprisingly, these were met with fear and controversy. Much of that was related to the question of what actually passes when blood passes from one body to another. What does it carry with it? And a lot of people felt that blood transfusion induced physical, mental, and psychological changes in the recipient, and blood was often given not as a replacement for blood loss, but in order to cure perceived defects in the temperament of the recipient. So the blood of a calm lamb would be given to an agitated person to try and calm them down. So after some further transfusions led to deaths, the French government banned this practice, and the Fellows of the Royal Society gave it up. And so nothing was done then for the next 150 years. So we'll jump ahead to 1818, and here comes James Blundell. So he's a British obstetrician who performed a series of transfusion experiments in dogs, and these were motivated on his part because he was an obstetrician, and he attended the death of a woman who died from postpartum hemorrhage, and he reflected afterwards that she might have been saved by transfusion. So that led him to do these transfusion experiments in dogs, where he would bleed the dog to the point of death and then revive it by transfusing blood from another dog. And through this series of experiments, he concluded that arterial and venous blood were equally good for restoring life, that blood wasn't rendered ineffective by passing through a syringe, and concluded that in transfusing humans, one should really only use human blood and not animal blood. So he reported the first human-to-human transfusion in December of 1818 to the Medical Chirurgical Society of London. The patient was a man suffering from a stomach tumor, and he was transfused with 12 to 13 ounces of blood that was collected from a number of gentlemen that were in attendance. And the patient initially improved, this is what he reported, but eventually declined and died after 3 days. And over the next few years, Blundell performed a small number of transfusions. So he reported in 1825 on 6 cases, none of which were successful, and including 2 patients who actually had already died by the time he transfused them. But nevertheless, he concluded that transfusion by the syringe is a very feasible and useful operation, and that after undergoing the usual ordeal of neglect, opposition, and ridicule, it will hereafter be admitted into general practice. A very insightful man. So he persevered, and in 1828 he was finally able to report in the Lancet a case of successful transfusion. This was again a young woman who was suffering from postpartum hemorrhage, and she received about 8 ounces of blood procured from the arm of Mr. Davies and injected over the course of about 3 hours. And you'll notice the use of the phrase pabulum vitae, which means nourishment of life. So this reflected a vitalist understanding of blood as a form of nourishment rather than as a replacement for a quantity of blood that was lost. So there we go. So performing these direct transfusions was difficult, and because of the risk of transfusion reactions, transfusion didn't really become common practice until early in the 20th century. And in fact, without knowledge of the major blood groups, was it surprising that any were even successful? I mean, what was the actual risk of major transfusion reactions? Well, if we look at the prevalence of blood groups, of blood donors in the UK from present day, we actually can see that about 65% of random donor-recipient pairs would actually be compatible just based on ABO classification. So your chances were better than a coin toss, but not by much. So this brings us now to 1900 and the discovery of the major blood groups. So this was a landmark year in the history of transfusion medicine. So Karl Landsteiner, depicted on this stamp from Austria, was an Austrian biologist and physician. And actually the first mention of blood groups was in a footnote of a paper that he published in 1900 that dealt with natural antibodies. And he wrote in this footnote, that the serum of healthy people not only agglutinates animal red cells, but also those of human origin from other individuals. And it would remain to be seen whether this was an inborn or genetic difference between individuals or the result of damage, for example, the consequence of an infection. So he did a definitive study which he published in 1901 in 22 subjects, and he examined the interaction between the sera and red blood cells of 22 healthy individuals. And this paper, by the way, was originally published in German, but was translated into English and reprinted in the inaugural issue of Transfusion in 1961. It's available online, and I really recommend that you read it if you're interested. It's really fascinating. So he looked at these interactions between sera and blood cells of healthy individuals, whom he all named in the study. You can see his name in the list there. There are no privacy laws back then. And as he had noted in the footnote, these agglutination reactions had been thought to be a manifestation of disease, but he recognized that this was an immunological reaction. So he grouped the sera into 3 groups. The first, which he called Group A. The sera from people in Group A would agglutinate with the red blood cells of people in Group B, shown in green here. So A is purple, green is B. And whereas the sera from Group B would agglutinate the red cells of Group A and wouldn't agglutinate their own red cells. And then a third group, which he originally called C, and to which he belonged, the red cells would not be agglutinated by the sera of either A or B, but the sera from this group would agglutinate both A and B red blood cells. So in other words, he demonstrated that there were 2 different agglutinins, one present in A, one present in B, and both present together in C. So A, B, and O. And then a year later, 2 of his students extended his study, did a much larger study in 155 subjects, confirmed his findings, and also identified 4 individuals in a 4th group, which they called AB, whose red cells were agglutinated by the sera from all 3 previously identified groups. So now we have the 4 major blood groups, A, B, O, and AB. And Landsteiner recognized the importance of this discovery in relation to blood transfusion and the risk of transfusion reactions, but amazingly, blood grouping didn't become part of universal practice until into the 1920s. Later, Landsteiner was recognized for this discovery. He won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1930. And the same year, the recipient of the Literature Prize, Sinclair Lewis, remarked at the award ceremony, "You may call me the master of words, but what is he? He has been, in 1,000 cases, the master of death." So Landsteiner's been depicted on a number of different stamp issues over the years. This is a stamp from Romania issued in 1999 that was part of a series depicting important landmarks over the past millennium. And this was what really drew me into the history of transfusion medicine. So you can see the picture of Landsteiner there, and the ABO blood groups with the red cell antigens and the agglutinins, and there's even a little diagram of compatibility that you can see here. Get this cursor, so a little diagram of compatibility. But there are these small numbers, Roman numerals in parentheses, beside the major ABO groups. So what are these? I didn't know what these were. So many of you have probably never heard of this man, Jan Jansky. He was a Czech neurologist and psychiatrist, and what does he have to do with transfusion medicine? Well, here he is on a medal that was given out to voluntary blood donors by the Czechoslovak Red Cross. So he was a neurologist. He was interested in examining whether there was a link between mental illness and blood groups. And so he did a study. Of course, he didn't find an association, but he published this report, which he called the Hematological Study of Psychotics, in which he classified blood into 4 groups that he numbered 1 through 4 in order of frequency. And at the time, because it was published in the Czech language, it really went virtually unnoticed. So 3 years later, in 1910, an American physician named William Moss also worked out the reciprocal agglutination reactions of the 4 blood groups, which he also called 1 to 4. And so this is known as the Moss classification system. But of course, and because his classification, his report was in English, his system was more widely used than the Jansky system, especially in the US, France, and in England. However, both systems were in use, and you can see the problem right away, right? So Group O and Group AB were given different numerals in the Jansky and Moss classification systems, and this led to confusion in teaching and it also raised the possibility of serious accidents, especially if individuals were grouped at different hospitals using different classification systems. So in 1921, in order to try and remedy the situation, committees were struck, and they made a recommendation that everyone should start using the Jansky system based on the fact that it was the first single study that described all 4 blood groups. So although this was made on the basis of scientific priority, what they neglected to do was actually look at what the prevalent classifications were in use at the time they made their recommendation. So here's a report that was published in 1929 looking at the classifications that were in use at that time, but they also reported that in 1920, so you'll notice first of all that up to 25% of hospitals in 1920 still weren't doing blood grouping, they were only doing cross-matching. But of the hospitals that were doing grouping, the vast majority of them were actually using the Moss system and not the Jansky system. So they were trying to get everybody to switch to using the Jansky system. But by 1927, 6 years after that recommendation was made, only an additional 10 hospitals had switched to using the Jansky system. And in fact, of all the hospitals that started grouping after the recommendation was made, the vast majority of them adopted Moss rather than Jansky, and some even switched from Jansky to Moss. So clearly that recommendation didn't work. So then in 1927, they made a different recommendation, this time based on scientific, they recommended that everyone should use Landsteiner's international ABO classification based on the fact that it expressed the actual antigens that were present on red cells, and it had a scientific basis and wasn't just an arbitrary numerical classification. So that seemed to make sense too. So was that any more successful? So if we look in this report from 1929, so this is a couple of years after that recommendation was made, only less than 5% of hospitals had adopted this international classification. Most were still using Moss. So maybe that wasn't enough time, it was only 2 years. So here's another study from 1938. More than 10 years after that recommendation, less than a quarter of hospitals were using the international system either alone or in combination with one of the numerical systems. So the net result of that second recommendation was now that there were 3 classification systems in use instead of just the former 2. So it was a big mess. Here's the situation in Ontario. So this was a study published, the results of a survey, this was published in 1940, results from 53 hospitals representing about 90% of general hospital beds in Ontario. So only Ottawa was using the international system, Toronto was using the Jansky system, and Hamilton, London, and Windsor were using the Moss system. And there were some places like Peterborough and Guelph where different hospitals were using different systems. So what led to us finally resolving or settling on one system? It was actually the outbreak of World War II. So with the movement of troops all over the world, it became very obvious that one universal system had to be widely adopted, and this is what finally led to Landsteiner's international classification being adopted. But even so, the Moss system was still in use well into the 1950s, and this is a card from 1941, but I've seen examples from the 1950s as well. So this would be a card that would be given to a blood donor. This is from the Manchester Royal Infirmary, and on the back it would tell the blood donor that he's group AB, i.e. group 1. But of course there's no indication that this refers to Moss, and so if you didn't actually have the AB there, you would have no idea if this guy was actually group AB or group O. So I'm going to change tracks and talk now a bit about the method of blood transfusion. So early on, there was no way to keep blood from clotting once it was taken out of the body, so transfusions had to be done directly from donor to recipient. And various devices were invented to assist with this procedure, and Blundell, in fact, invented a couple of devices that were basically funnel-like, or funnels that would collect the blood, and either through the action of a syringe or through gravity would then direct the blood into the vein of the recipient, and furniture was used in creative ways to mount these devices. But they were very awkward to use, and of course it was very difficult to keep the blood from clotting, and so But even so, these were in use until into the early 1900s. And here's actually a scene. This is a page from Harper's Weekly, which was an American political magazine. This is from 1874 that shows a scene of transfusion in a Paris hospital, and you can see the funnel here that's collecting the blood spurting out of this guy's arm and going into this pale young woman there. So George Washington Cryle, who was an American surgeon and a co-founder of the Cleveland Clinic, used a different approach. So he firmly believed that transfusion would be a useful therapy for shock, and he tried actually anastomosing the blood vessels of the donor and the recipient. So he tried connecting the artery of the donor to a vein of the recipient. And he experimented on animals, but was never able to prevent leakage or clot formation until he, by chance, happened to meet a French surgeon named Alexis Carrel in Chicago in 1905. And Carrel later won a Nobel Prize for his pioneering vascular suturing techniques. And so Cryle adopted some of his methods and then was finally able to successfully perform the first human-to-human direct transfusion using this method of anastomosing the artery of a donor with the vein of a recipient. So this would be the kind of setup that he would have with the donor and recipient lying on opposite tables. And he reported in 1906 on 6 cases of 6 transfusions that he performed in 5 patients, two of whom survived. And even though they weren't doing any blood grouping, he didn't note any ill effects. And in fact, in the first case, they were so taken aback by the clinical effect on the recipient that they nearly bled the donor into hypovolemic shock, because they were just, there was actually no way to actually measure how much blood was being transferred. So, there's a lot of disadvantages to his approach. He likened the profound clinical effect of the transfusion to relief of asphyxia by intubation. That was how profound it was to him. But of course, it required a 3-hour surgery to perform a transfusion that only lasted a few minutes, and there was no way to actually measure the amount of blood that was being transferred from donor to recipient. So a few years later, Edward Lindemann from New York invented or developed a very simple syringe cannula system that ended up becoming quite popular for direct transfusion. So this involved 2 sets of cannulas, which are very similar to the kinds of things we use today, and multiple syringes to transfer blood from the donor to the recipient. And the advantage of this system was that because of the needle, you didn't need to make an incision, and the use of the syringes actually allowed you to measure the amount of blood that was being transferred. So this was in use for quite some time as well. However, it was 1914, World War I was looming, and wounded soldiers would be brought to casualty clearing stations for stabilization prior to being transferred to a field hospital for definitive treatment. And it was known that soldiers could die from blood loss even when the wound itself was not fatal. However, direct transfusion was really impossible to organize on the scale that would be needed in wartime. So physicians desperately needed a way of separating the donor and the recipient in both space and time. So Luis Agote, who is an Argentinian physician and researcher, is generally given credit for performing the first indirect transfusion using blood that was anticoagulated with a small amount of citrate. So he performed this transfusion in a hospital in Buenos Aires in November 1914. The centenary of that was just recently celebrated on a stamp issued by Argentina. And this was reported a few days later in the papers in New York, and it created quite a sensation. And he published a report of it in early 1915. And almost at the same time, a surgeon in New York, Richard Lewison, published a very similar report. He had done a lot of experiments with anticoagulating blood with small amount of citrate as well. So these 2 gentlemen really developed this at around the same time. So Oswald Robertson, who was a U.S. Captain in the U.S. Army Medical Corps serving in France, used or capitalized on these developments, and he devised an integrated collection and transfusion apparatus where blood would be collected into a citrated solution and then could be transfused indirectly into the recipient. And he used this method to perform a series of 44 indirect transfusions under rush conditions at a casualty clearing station. So now the donor and recipient could be separated in space, which allowed the transfusion to be administered by a single medic, and also it meant that you didn't have to move the recipient in order to do the transfusion. However, it was still difficult to find donors and collect blood from them. The donors were usually lightly wounded soldiers, and to collect blood from them under rush conditions, it wasn't very practical. And so they still, it's still good to have a way to try and bank the blood. So there were reports around that time that refrigeration and storage of blood in a glucose solution would actually allow blood to be stored for a longer period of time. So Robertson modified his apparatus to collect the blood into a sugar solution, and he collected and stored blood, group O blood, ahead of time before the arrival of casualties at the Battle of Cambrai, which was a big tank battle in France in November 1917. And this is really the first practical example of blood banking, and it enabled the donor and recipient now to be separated not only in space but also time. So let's jump ahead now to the Spanish Civil War. This was the next big conflict that drove new developments in transfusion medicine practice. So during the Spanish Civil War was a fight between the Republican government and General Franco's nationalist rebels. And in order to support the Republican Army, mobile blood transfusion services were set up in Madrid and Barcelona. So we all know, of course, Dr. Norman Bethune. He was a chest surgeon originally from Gravenhurst, Ontario, who went to Spain to help the Republican side. And he saw that his services as a surgeon weren't needed as critically as what he organized, which was a mobile transfusion service that he called the Canadian Blood Transfusion Service. And they would collect blood from donors, civilian donors in Madrid, and they supplied almost every military sector in Spain. And at the peak, they were performing up to 100 transfusions a day. However, although his service is very well known to us in Canada, he actually wasn't the very first one. So he didn't arrive in Spain until November of 1936. And in August of 1936, a Spanish hematologist named Federico Horta had actually set up a similar mobile transfusion service that was based in Barcelona. So here he is on the left here, collecting blood from this donor. And over the course of about 2.5 years during the Spanish Civil War, they collected over 9,000 liters of blood from nearly 30,000 donors. And they transported the donor blood to the front lines using refrigerated trucks with the logo of the service on the side. They recruited donors using campaigns, patriotic messages, support your fighters, save the life of a fighter. And to raise money, they printed these Cinderella stamps. So they're not postage stamps for mailing a letter, but they were just stamps that would raise money, and they had the emblem of the Blood Donors Association on them, where they've taken the 4 red bars of the Shield of Catalonia and turned them into streams of blood. So Horta devised an ingenious blood collection system. I think Jamie, as an engineer, you might appreciate this. I don't know where he went. So he wanted to have a system that could be used to transfuse a patient in any place, at any time, by any member of the medical personnel. So what he devised was this sealed glass bottle, and blood would be collected into the bottom chamber, and the bottle would be stored upright so that the red cells would settle, and then you could view the plasma and check it for hemolysis. The upper chamber would be filled with compressed air, and that oxygenated the blood and kept it bright red. So if there was contamination with aerobic organisms, it would consume the oxygen and the blood would turn dark red. So it was a visual check for sterility. And there was a glass partition that separated the 2 chambers and prevented a free surface of blood, so that reduced the hemolysis of blood from shaking during the transport. And then to transfuse, they would just attach a needle to the stopcock at the bottom here, break a capillary seal, invert the tube to mix the blood, and then the compressed air would drive the blood into the vein of the recipient. And so here's another Cinderella stamp where you can see a representation of this blood bottle on wheels representing the mobile transfusion service of this that he organized. So towards the end of the Spanish Civil War, when it looked like the Republican side was going to lose, Horta fled to London, and he worked with Dr. Janet Vaughan at Hammersmith to help set up a series of blood banks in London. And the War Office in Britain prepared for the war by setting up a blood supply depot and establishing a British Army blood transfusion service that was headed by Lionel Whitby. And this was the first wholly military blood transfusion service in the world. So it was totally military run. They collected blood from civilian donors and shipped them to all the places that the British Army was fighting. And donors would be given cards like this that would thank them for their personal service that they rendered to their country. This is a page from a booklet that was given out to donors that had a map showing them where all their donated blood was being transported to, all the different front lines. And the booklet also contained a partial transcript of a broadcast by Godfrey Talbot, who was a BBC observer embedded with the 8th Army. And he noted that it's no exaggeration to say that blood transfusion on a big scale is one of the biggest and finest medical service developments in this war. So here you see the picture of a dispatch rider picking up blood from an advanced blood bank. There's a bat there because it's the British Army Transfusion Service, BATS, to take it to a casualty clearing station to treat a wounded soldier. Civilian donors were considered to be civil defense volunteers. So they would be given identity cards like this that told them that they were entitled to all the benefits granted to such civil defense volunteers. Recruitment campaigns for blood donors gave civilians at home a chance to contribute to the war effort in a tangible way. And this was a very successful approach or strategy to recruit donors. It turned blood donation to a patriotic act, and it was used not only in Great Britain, but also in Canada and the United States. Most messages were positive, save the life of a soldier, although I did find this one brochure from Canada that has the opposite tact. Don't let, for want of a pint of blood, here lies Johnny Canuck, don't let him die. In the absence of social media that we have today, no Facebook or Instagram, how did they get the message out? So they made posters, which could appear on the side of streetcars. You can see this little poster here with the blood donation message. Mail was a very important way to send the message out. So this was metered mail that had messages: give a pint of your blood to save the life of one of our fighting men. Your blood can save him, be a blood donor. Private companies also helped to get the message out. So this is a matchbook cover that was printed by the Arcade Sunshine Laundry in DC, showing, easy math there. And if you needed help with it, they tell you it's as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. You can save the life of an American boy. Here's a magazine ad that was taken out in 1943 in Life magazine by the Prudential Insurance Company, showing a young woman donating blood and saving the life of an injured soldier. So in 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. And as soon as the Second World War ended, surprisingly, all these wartime blood programs came to an abrupt halt. So here's a card that was mailed out to somebody on the 29th of August, just 2 weeks after Japan surrendered, before even the formal papers had been signed. Stating that in view of the termination of hostilities, we've been instructed to immediately stop all procurement of blood for the armed forces. So all these wonderful blood programs that they had set up to collect blood and distribute it, it was all terminated. And of course, they realized after a short period of time that blood was needed not only in wartime, but also in peacetime. And so in this post-war period when there weren't televisions in every household, how did they get the message out that blood donors were still urgently needed? Well, the mail helped to disseminate that message then too. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I'll just leave you with this image from the World's Blood Donor Day in 2012. World Blood Donor Day is celebrated every year on Karl Landsteiner's birthday, June 14th, to raise awareness for the need for safe blood and to thank blood donors for their life-saving gifts. So thank you very much for your attention.
Questions or comments? Bob, do you have anything to add? We have something back there, but we need a mic. We have mic runners?
Hello, I'm just wondering why they changed it from C to O.
So Landsteiner just initially labeled them A, B, and C, but it became O because of the lack of antigens on the red blood cells. But it's interesting, when it was just written communications, when you write an O, it could either be 0 or the letter O, and the distinction between 0 and O didn't become important until people started typing and having electronic communication. And there's a little bit of controversy over who initially started using maybe the number 0 or the letter O, but eventually they actually had a committee to get together and decide whether they were going to use 0 or O, and Landsteiner himself said, no, we should use O. So that's how it became O.
Thank you very much for the very wonderful talk. Regarding the blood transfusion during the Second World War, it was always the whole blood, isn't it?
So they did blood, but actually because they were transporting blood to tropical places, it was actually very hard to store the blood, and so there were they developed dried plasma or dried serum. In Canada, they developed dried serum, and that was much easier to ship, and it could be reconstituted once it got there. So I think initially they did use whole blood, but subsequently there was a lot of dried plasma as well.
When did they first start treating hemophiliacs? Did they ever try transfusing normal blood to hemophiliacs?
So actually, Bob probably can answer that question better. Yeah.
As some of you know, Manchu Poo and I have been working on the parallel on the hemophilia. The first transfusion of whole blood to a hemophiliac was by Samuel Lane in 1840, and he used the Blundell's gravitator. And there's still a debate. We haven't been able to sort out whether Blundell was actually there or not. So it was only not too long after the other. Plasma, the dried plasma though didn't have, the used in World War II didn't contain, it had lost its factor VIII, so it wasn't until the Red Cross got into operation and really into the 50s before.
I think it was after
Frozen.
cone fractionation, right? And then they got plasma.
Well, the cone fractionation led to the concentrates,
Yeah.
and it was developed by the U.S. Navy during World War II.
Just a comment about the first official blood transfusion program actually in Canada was here in Vancouver in 1948.
That's absolutely right. So after the end of the Second World War, there was a commission to examine the needs during peacetime that was done by Dr. Stanbury. And that eventually led to the Red Cross establishing a national blood program, and the very first center was opened in Vancouver, actually. And then centers were opened across Canada, but they started in Vancouver and ended up on the East Coast over a year or two, in 1947 to 48. So.
Thank you very
Thank you.
So we have a treat, another treat. So our next speaker is not a scientist. Is that true? No, she's not. But she is somebody who knows a lot about transfusion, but from a totally different perspective as a recipient. So she's going. Krista is actually a very active young woman and was a paramedic for quite a while, so she knows something about medicine. But then she became ill, and she's going to tell us our story about her experiences in the world of transfusion medicine. So Krista?
Yes, close mic. Yeah, no, it's good. So I just want you to sort of get a picture in your head. So imagine, if you will, receiving 220 units of blood over a 4-year period. Everyone got that in their heads? Okay. Now double that number in the same amount of time frame with no diagnosis and add about 1,000 bags of iron. And that's basically me on the medical side. And after listening to our last speaker, I'm glad for all the advancements in transfusion medicine. Yes, good afternoon. Thanks for having me here. My name is Krista Clokeed. I've been asked to speak to you about basically the life of a recipient and some of the frustrations and complications that this causes. Additionally, I hope to leave you all with a new perspective on those dealing with chronic blood disorders, and if I'm lucky, spark some interest in research. So my story, it's kind of like a mystery novel. It's filled with many, many chapters, some that don't make sense, draws in many different characters, includes suspense, intrigue, sadness, and even another young woman just like me. The book is now very, very thick, and if it were to be published, I'm pretty sure it would be considered too odd to even be true. As so many of the specialists have told me, this can't actually happen in real life, but it does. So now a little bit about myself. I'm now 33 years old. When I was 27, I was an active, healthy, independent woman working full-time as a paramedic in Metro Edmonton. At 28, one day I was feeling fine. I thought I'd just overdone it at the gym. And then I was deathly ill, rushed to hospital, and received my first of so many blood transfusions. I didn't get better, and it was quite a devastating blow. My life was pretty much turned upside down. I could no longer work. I had to move back home with my parents, and I was in hospital for weeks at a time. It took all my strength and energy even to walk up a flight of stairs. My hemoglobin at its lowest was 45, and iron was not even measurable. And then at its highest, it sits at around 75 and 5 for iron. So for the next 3 years, I went through many tests, every test that could be thought of at the time, even a camera capsule test to see if I was bleeding, which was a very impressive test, but and exploratory surgeries as well, suggested but proven all to be wrong diagnoses. Trials of schedules for iron and blood to try and get the numbers up and not have it go down so much. And finally, my body just began to become used to always the constant low levels. Even right now, I'm only sitting at 71 with an iron of 4. So even though I'm still at those low numbers, I could finally at least function and feel like I had somewhat of a life back. Unfortunately, I still couldn't go back to work, to the job that I loved so much. I've still not received a full diagnosis or prognosis, and I'm just being managed and treated as the symptoms come up. I also have to be careful that I don't get transfused out, according to my hematologist, because I already have 5 antibodies. If I develop 5 more, I can no longer receive blood products. And I have also had 3 major infections that went septic, that also took me out of commission for about 2 weeks each. And then 2 years ago, I found out about another young woman. She actually lives in Kelowna. And she's 31 now. She was a professional ballet dancer working up in Kelowna up till she was, again, 28 years old. And she got deathly ill, and her hemoglobin plummeted. Since then, she has also had many tests, wrong diagnoses, and trial treatments. She also receives blood products every 2 weeks, like me. Has also developed 5 antibodies, and her hemoglobin ranges between 50 and 80. I have passed on the information to physicians about our similarities in our cases, as I have been told by everybody that I run into that my case is so rare. And yet, there seems to be no interest in getting the 2 cases together or compared to continue to try and seek answers. So for myself and Kelly, the biggest frustrations are the fact that we still have no answers. It's been almost 6 years for me, almost 4 for her. We have spent more time in hospital than we really have been enjoying our lives. And the fear of dying is very much real for both of us. The impact this illness has had has been horrendous. I lost my job as a paramedic. I lost my independence, my confidence, a sort of sense of purpose, and my ability to do things that I used to love to do. I've recently started back at school to enter a less rigorous profession. And even though I won't likely be able to work full-time, at least it's something. When it comes to the process of diagnoses and tests, the hardest part was the waiting period, feeling of being sort of like a pinball machine. You go to your GP, he sends you to a referral, then the specialist sees you, they decide that there's nothing on their end, it sends back to the GP, and it's just the same thing over and over again. The time it took for my GP to send referrals until I saw the specialist was as long as 4 months. And if they decided that there was nothing they could do, I went back to my GP, and yes, another 3 to 4 months waiting. I just can't help but wonder if there was more of a collaborative effort approach, like I've heard there is at the Mayo Clinic, that might have been able to move forward faster in my life. As usually 5 brains are better than 1 at a time. Speaking of the Mayo Clinic brings me up another dilemma in my long journey. There was talk of sending me to the Mayo Clinic, and it's still an option. Unfortunately, the money is an issue. With my experience of having my blood being tested for a genetic abnormality in the States, the geneticist spent weeks of her time investigating and putting a proposal together for the government for funding. What it comes down to is if there will be money saved for treatment, the government will consider covering the cost. There's no look at the actual person involved. Don't get me wrong, I've met tons of amazing healthcare professionals who've worked very hard to find answers, and a few not so great. I have learned to deal with the depression caused by the endless years of chronic illness, the fact that I will likely not be able to bear children of my own, but have been rewarded with much human kindness. And although myself and Kelly are just 2 people in this big world, it is our world. We're still individuals, we're daughters, people's sisters, friends, co-workers. We're a whole being, not defined by a health issue. And in real life, it could be your daughter, your sister, your brother, your friend. So basically, it's more of just wanting to shed light on what it's like to live with a chronic illness and the struggles. So my ask to all of you would be just be curious, stay interested in research and finding new answers. Never underestimate the strength of a patient. Don't judge people or make decisions based off of how they look or what they might reveal to you. Understand that after many years, sometimes the patient does know a few things that you may not know, and don't be offended when they question you about it. For people that suffer with chronic illness, keep them involved with the case and respect the fact that because they are living with it, they may present with less reaction to the symptoms than someone who may be newly diagnosed. When people ask me how I am, I often answer okay or fine, because it's easier than trying to explain my story over and over and over again. Not every patient is by the book. It's just a guideline. What you learn is just a guideline. Every person is their individual. And never get complacent. Always keep searching for answers. And if you run out of answers from your traditional training, think outside the box. That's generally when new advancements are made. It's okay if you don't know the answer. We're all human, but don't make stuff up and don't fill in the blanks on your own. Collaborate with other healthcare professionals in similar fields with similar cases. Research and cures for disease don't come easy, but they do come from people who never lose hope or effort, for those who search for the light even if it's dim. So that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for letting me talk today. I hope the information was informative and helpful. And does anybody have any questions?
I'd like to thank Krista for speaking today. I know it's a real challenge, and I think you have given a very clear message. It's a message that we have to constantly remember, that patients have a story to tell, and the reason we're here is that there are continuous challenges to taking care of patients, which is ultimately our goal. It's our goal, the goal of our sponsors and our industry partners as well. And this is an example of a multidisciplinary collaboration where we really do seek answers to not necessarily specifically your problem, but the problems of other individuals as well. So your message is taken to heart. It's one of the reasons we do invite patients to speak at these kinds of these symposia. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. So, hi Jackie, wake up. I caught that yawn. All right, so Jacqueline Trudeau is a staff anesthesiologist at Vancouver General Hospital and a trainee at the Canadian Blood Service, in the Canadian Blood Service's Transfusion Medicine Fellowship program. Her interests include perioperative coagulation and patient blood management. She, in addition to her medical degree, she also happened to obtain a PhD in immunology at Simon Fraser University, and then actually she completed her medical school in anesthesiology training here at UBC. She's a passionate and terrific educator, and happens to be also a mom of 2 young kids, which I guess keeps her a little more active. Jackie.
Thanks. Can you guys hear me over there? No. Okay, closer. Is that better? Okay. Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor. This is a pretty esteemed lineup today. And thank you very much, Krista, for being brave enough to share your story. That's not an easy task to be up here, as we all know. Inspiring. I have no disclosures, financial or otherwise. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about ROTEM, amongst other things, and I have no affiliations with any of those folks. So this is where I work. This is Vancouver General Hospital, just across the bridge, not far from here. I am an anesthesiologist, a practicing anesthesiologist, and as Ed mentioned, I also happen to be doing, on the side, transfusion medicine fellowship, and as mentioned, my main interests there are specifically in patient blood management with a focus on perioperative coagulation. I spend a lot of time doing liver transplantation anesthesiology. This is my shout out to Dr. Patty for her talk this morning, because I was a little bit aghast when she said, what is the clinical relevance of vascular permeability? And this is shows you on the x-axis how bad my day is directly proportional to the degree of vascular permeability. Because really, critical care medicine wouldn't exist if vascular permeability wasn't a problem. So I thought it was great. So I thought, I think probably this is the peak of postprandial sleepiness. So I hope this mixes it up a little bit. It's a bit of a different talk than you've seen so far today. What I'd like to do is talk to you about how we introduced ROTEM, which is not new, at Vancouver General Hospital in the context of thinking about a comprehensive patient blood management program. And we did use quite a different model for this, which I'll talk a little bit about, and I'm happy to discuss with people online as well. I'm going to show you a couple of clinical cases, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some thought provocation on sort of potential impacts on blood utilization and product management in Canada and beyond, as many of you will already be aware. So Vancouver General Hospital is a big place. It's a tertiary care referral level 1 trauma center. They tell me it's Canada's second largest hospital. We have 21 functional operating rooms, and every year they continually take away all of our low acuity patients and replace them with high acuity patients. So it's basically a center of excellence for everything that everybody else doesn't want to do. We do about 700 cardiac cases every year, about 300 high-risk trauma patients, almost 100 liver transplants per year, and probably about 30 to 40 ECMO starts per year. This is a graphic that shows you that highlights the rise in interest in patient blood management over time. So on the y-axis is a number of publications, and on the x-axis is time. And you can see since the early 2000s, people have been thinking a lot about patient blood management and appropriate product utilization. And that comes largely from studies like this one. This is a 2015 paper from Surgery, published by Victor Ferreras and colleagues, who's a cardiothoracic surgeon in Kentucky. And this is a paper like many, many others, which is basically a large retrospective big data project looking at about 500,000 patients. And it basically shows that anemia and transfusion, when done in a propensity matched analysis sort of fashion, both predict worse outcomes in surgical patients, and that's shown here. So basically patients with neither anemia or transfusion are shown as in blue, with complications lined up on the y-axis, and patients who are both anemic preoperatively, or patients that get transfused, but much, much worse in patients who are both anemic and get transfused, have worse complications. So what does patient blood management mean in the context of the perioperative period? So we can break that down into preoperative optimization, perioperative factors and perioperative optimization, and the postoperative recovery phase. So in the preoperative period, sometimes we do very simple things like try to delay one's surgery while we optimize them. We hope to diagnose and manage their anemia with things like oral or IV iron or EPO if appropriate. We manage complicated cases like complicated antibody cases, bleeding disorder patients, patients with signed refusals going for complex surgery, and we liaise with surgery and anesthesia for planning and recommending certain techniques in the operating room. In the operation itself, it is a lot about planning, education, and awareness for what's appropriate for that patient. We do a lot of education and planning around appropriate transfusion practice, appropriate transfusion triggers, use of antifibrinolytics where necessary or where appropriate, use of intraoperative cell salvage, sometimes even phlebotomy, or what is formerly known as acute normal volemic hemodilution, which I like to call phlebotomy. And there are many anesthetic and surgical techniques that I won't get into that can also be used that have direct impacts on how much a patient will bleed. And in the post-op recovery phase, a lot of those things hold true, and it is basically a continuation of many of those same techniques. So I'm going to talk today primarily about this piece here, which is education, awareness, and appropriate transfusion practice. So one of the reasons I'm so interested in this, and we spend a lot of time thinking about this, is that we have a lot of room for improvement. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data, provincial data, and this is for cardiac surgery patients. This is broken down roughly into low risk and high risk patients, so low risk patients being CABG and valve, high risk patients being combined procedures or aortic procedures, and so those are shown in gray and yellow, and over time you can see that about between 50 and 70% of our patients are getting transfused, which if you compare that across internationally, that's actually quite a high number, higher than programs with similar acuity. And if you look on a number of units transfused over the same period and the same patient population, you can see that often patients are getting in the order of 5 to 7 units per case. And the other place that we have sort of, I believe, room for improvement is in our rapidly expanding liver transplant program. So this is the number of liver transplants that we've done over time at VGH, and in 2016 that number was in the sort of low to mid 90s. So we're doing between 80 and 100 liver transplant per year now, and we're already exceeding that rate in 2017. And this is a place where the contemporary knowledge of how to manage patients with end-stage liver disease is expanding at a rapid rate. So appropriate transfusion practice is really changing. And similar transfusion data shows you that over time, essentially, all comers liver transplants coming to the operating room, we're giving them about, on average, 10 units of red cells per case. So the transfusion level is high, or the amount of transfusion they're receiving is quite high. So one of the changes that we've made among many is implementation of a rotational thromboelastometry program, or ROTEM program, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And this looks at the number of publications of ROTEM or TEG, which are similar technologies over time. ROTEM or TEG in gray and ROTEM alone in blue. And you can see this inflection point over here. And TEG, this technology was first described in 1948, so this is not a new idea, but rather a resurgence in interest that I think is quite coincident with this appreciation of a cell-based model of hemostasis that was really nicely described in the early 2000s by Hoffman and Monroe. And this is how a simple clinician thinks about coagulation, so I apologize to this group. But I like to think of it and teach it this way because it's actually quite helpful. So the goal here is to really change the way that the standard clinician thinks about coagulation, which is INRs and PTTs, from simply a plasma-based coagulation test to rather a more holistic approach that involves clot formation, clot strength, and clot breakdown. So what is ROTEM? I know that a lot of people in this audience are very familiar with this test. I know that many of you use it. In the spirit of keeping everyone in the game, I'm going to quickly go through what the test is and how it's used, and you're going to get the world's fastest tutorial in how to interpret images so we can look at some cases. So ROTEM is meant to be a test of whole blood coagulation. So it's meant to look at blood clot formation kinetics, clot strength, and dissolution. So this is a machine that is typically used at the point of care, which means in the operating room or in the trauma bay, or near point of care, which means in the little side room off of the operating room or the trauma bay. And we did something that looks quite a lot different than that, which is probably the only novel thing about what we've done here, which I'll talk about in a moment. This technology was introduced first in Europe, so they're really the leaders in this particular technology. FDA approved in 2011 and approved here in Canada in late 2012. And what happens is this. So 300 microliters of whole blood gets pipetted into a tiny little cup that's about like this, and then a little linear probe goes in the cup and it spins about a longitudinal axis. So you can imagine in blood that it doesn't clot at all, that pin spins quite freely, and as blood clot forms, the impedance to pin rotation is slowed. And that information is captured on an optical detector, and it's spat out as a graphical reading. And the graphical reading looks something like this. So this is how it works in real time, sort of real time, not really, schematic real time. So time along the x-axis and something called amplitude on the y-axis. I like to call this clot firmness or clot strength, with a little bit of a stopwatch at the top. So the first thing you get is a straight line, which is meant to be the clotting time, and it's roughly can be interpreted as the interaction of proteinaceous clotting factors. And then as you progress, more and more of this picture comes out. So you get something called a clot formation time, which is meant to represent the interaction of platelets and fibrinogen as they come together to form a clot. And then you get sort of your clot at its fattest, so to speak. And in normal people, that should stay and look like that. And if you get clot breakdown in a premature fashion, you have something called hyperfibrinolysis, which is essentially premature clot breakdown, which is pathologic. So in so doing, you get information about clot initiation, the kinetics of clot formation, how strong your clot is, and whether it's being broken down. And the idea here is now that you can break this down and you can look at initiation of clot formation. You can look at formation kinetics, or how well all of that is coming together to initiate clot formation. You can look at clot strength, so how strong is my blood clot, and then you can look at clot breakdown. And the idea now is that instead of this sort of quote-unquote shotgun approach to hemorrhage management and transfusion management, when things get a little nasty, now you are meant to be able to, when the time is right, direct your transfusion to what is missing. So like many times in my life, I'm going to summarize about more than 1 year of work with one simple slide, which is basically the whole program development at VGH, which was a bunch of super multidisciplinary collaborative people coming together to basically allow us to implement this program. So what we've done is we have a lab-based ROTEM program. So we have 2 ROTEM machines in the hematology lab downstairs at VGH, which is directly below the operating rooms. And the results of the data as it is being produced in real time is live streamed to all the critical care patient areas. So we can see data as it's being generated in the trauma bay, in the ICU, in the operating rooms, and so on. Multiple caregivers can look at the same patient information in multiple locations. So it's really nice for patients that traverse from the trauma bay into the operating room and so on. It is beyond the scope of this talk to sort of go through why we chose to do it that way, but certainly it is the only center in Canada that has done it that way, and it's amongst probably about a dozen centers in the US that have chosen to go this route. But certainly it provides both advantages and disadvantages over the machine that's sitting at the bedside in the ICU or the OR or the trauma bay. And I'm happy to discuss that at any point with anyone in the room. So I'm going to show you a couple of clinical cases to show you, to keep you awake mostly, and to show you how this is changing our practice and potentially changing our product utilization. I like to call this case "Don't Play with Knives." It's shocking what you get on Google when you Google "Don't Play with Knives" images. This was one of the most benign images that I could find. So This is Monday, December 19th. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. There's a 42-year-old man waving a machete at a SkyTrain station, and he's shot once in the abdomen by the police. So he has a gunshot wound to the upper abdomen, just left of the midline, and an exit wound near the spine. This is a gunshot in the box, as the trauma surgeons like to say. There's obviously lots of important structures in that area. He arrests at the scene, and on initiation of CPR, has return of spontaneous circulation. He is brought to hospital, arrives within about 15 to 20 minutes. He has a palpable femoral pulse, no blood pressure reading, heart rate of 135, and at that time the trauma exsanguination protocol, or the TEP, is activated in the trauma bay. So this is his first ROTEM, and for those of you who look at ROTEMs, the first thing that's immediately obvious, so this is at 9:40 in the morning, and remember he got shot at 9:15 or thereabouts, and one of the first things you'll notice is he's exhibiting quite a significant degree of hyperfibrinolysis. And the reason we don't often see this anymore is because we almost universally give tranexamic acid in the field now to severely injured trauma patients. And I'm guessing that he didn't get tranexamic acid in the field because he was busy trying to die and they were resuscitating him. So this is an interesting picture because this actually predicts quite significant mortality. So he, and then the other thing to note here is that, just take my word for it, in the context of a rapidly bleeding patient, this degree of clot fatness on the pink side, which is meant to interrogate fibrinogen function, is just not enough for what's going to ensue for this man. So within the context of ongoing bleeding, certainly fibrinogen is indicated, fibrinogen or cryoprecipitate. So at the time, the trauma team administered tranexamic acid, 4 units of Paxils, and a unit of frozen plasma. He then goes to the operating room, and the operating room management is summarized in a couple slides here, but he loses about 5 liters of blood. He's in the operating room for about 2 hours, and anesthesia is attempting to do a sort of ROTEM-guided resuscitation. This is his second ROTEM, now at 10:15, I think that is. Apologize for the PC to Mac confusion. But you can notice immediately that that degree of hyperfibrinolysis is gone, and that lack of robustness on the pink side, the fibrinogen side, is still lacking. So you see that here in a sluggish clot formation time and a low fibrinogen level. And then his subsequent one looks much the same. So they repeat his test at about 11:40 and still behind on fibrinogen resuscitation. And in total in the operating room he gets 13 units of Paxils, 11 units of frozen plasma, 3 adult doses of platelets, and 30 of cryo. And together with what he had previously, that's 17, 12, 12, and 30, if you will, which is essentially a 1-to-1-to-1-to-1 resuscitation, a little shy on the cryoprecipitate side. And in fact, when he arrives to the ICU for ongoing resuscitation and a ROTEM's repeated, you can see that again here. Trauma patients use up a lot of fibrinogen. So similar results here, still a little lacking in fibrinogen. They give him some fibrinogen concentrate, and he does reasonably well. So this was a damage control laparotomy, so his tummy remains open and gets taken to the operating room the next morning, and when they reinterrogate him, now you can see the effects of that fibrinogen resuscitation on the pink side here. It's nice and fat, which suggests that his fibrinogen stores are adequate, but this looks a bit sluggish, so meaning that the clot formation kinetics here are a bit slow, so an adult dose of platelets is given at that time. He's taken to the operating room and does reasonably well. Didn't require any additional blood products. So this was a really nice sort of classic case of how this tool can help guide clinicians in the management of ongoing bleeding. The next slide is a repeat ROTEM that was done on this same fellow about 2 weeks later. And I think this slide is super interesting because this is the discussion that happens with every trauma patient, particularly ones that are head injured that come into hospital. So the ICU physicians say, we really need to anticoagulate this patient because they're super high risk of DVT and PE. And the neurosurgeons say, you can't anticoagulate him because he's going to bleed. And then the ICU physicians repeat the same thing, and the neurosurgeons repeat the same thing. And then about 7 days later, he has a PE, and then the neurosurgeons say, okay, fine, you can go ahead and anticoagulate him. So we really have no idea what's happening between the time those patients come in and they're hypocoagulable. We know they all become hypercoagulable to some degree, and nobody really knows how and when that transition is happening. And we captured this, not by accident really, but this sort of demonstrates, I think, demonstrates how hypercoagulable these patients become, but it really sort of points to potentially an interesting clinical application that we're thinking about exploring. I'll show you one more case. This is Richard. He lives on the island. He lives with his partner. He has a cat. His sister died about 2 years ago from NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is a disease that often affects people with metabolic syndrome and fatty livers, et cetera, except Richard and his sister are like the two most clean living people you've ever met, and now he presents with the same disease and shows up for a liver transplant. So a really touching story. Other than his liver failure, he's pretty well for a liver transplant patient. He starts with a hemoglobin of 122, platelets of 109, INR of 1.9, and a fibrinogen of 1.4. And we have started doing a series of ROTEMs on all our liver transplant patients because it's one of the areas that is actually not particularly well studied. And what we're seeing, so when he comes into the operating room, we're doing ROTEMs on these guys before we even cut skin. So he gets 2 units taken off as a phlebotomy at the beginning of the case. And that is meant to lower his portal pressures, so he bleeds less. And his lab values after that are here, but interestingly, his ROTEM is here. And what we're seeing in a lot of our liver transplant patients is that before we even do anything to them, they're a little bit hyperfibrinolytic, meaning that they're breaking down blood clot before we even start. That, in the context of a low fibrinogen function, puts us in a bit of a difficult spot before even starting. So he gets tranexamic acid in a very conservative fashion and an infusion to reverse this hyperfibrinolysis that you see here, and 4 grams of fibrinogen concentrate. And his repeat ROTEM, which is basically right at the beginning of the anhepatic phase, which is where we take out the liver, looks like this. So it looks good. Good clot fatness, no premature breakdown, in good shape with fibrinogen. But the striking part about these guys, as their liver is out and you put the new liver in and you start to reperfuse them, is they consume profound amounts of fibrinogen. And you see that here. So less than an hour later, we're sort of back to where we started, if you will. And this is about 15 minutes after having the new liver in. Everything gets reperfused. All of the evil humors from the liver in a box get released into the body, and you're sort of left trying to hold the fort down. And you can see his numbers there. Hemoglobin's 82, INR's 3.2, fibrinogen's 1. So he gets ongoing TXA infusion, another 4 grams of fibrinogen concentrate, and the 900 cc's of phlebotomized blood that was taken off at the beginning of the case, whole blood, liquid gold for resuscitating the liver transplant patients, and cell saver blood that we collect throughout. And this is what his repeat ROTEM looks like when we send him off to the ICU after his operation. So this is about an hour and a half post-reperfusion. You can see his numbers here. So historically, this guy would have gotten frozen plasma to fix his INR before his operation. He would have gotten frozen plasma through his whole operation because darn it, that INR still isn't fixed. And then he'd go to the ICU with an INR of 3, and the euboxemia masters in the ICU would give him frozen plasma until the INR is down to 1.5, which, as you all know, is quite difficult. So now I bring the printout or take a picture of this on my phone, and I bring the guy to the ICU and I put him there and I say, he's not bleeding. This is what his ROTEM looks like. Do not touch him. And it's working. It's going well. So this is really changing for us how we manage liver transplant patients. And it's not to say that it wouldn't have happened without this technology, but I think it's helping people have another piece of information that's giving them some backup, if you will, to feel good about those clinical decisions. So this is a guy now who got 8 grams of fibrinogen concentrate and 1,000 cc's of albumin and a bit of crystalloid for his liver transplant operation. And those are becoming more and more common now, which is lovely. Definitely a difference in practice. And you can see by post-op day 1, of course, because the liver's working well and he's not over-resuscitated, so his liver's not congested, he's got good blood flow through his liver, synthetic function returns, and everything corrects. So it's lovely. So I'm going to show you a little bit of exceptionally preliminary data that looks at cryoprecipitate and fibrinogen use at Vancouver General Hospital over time. So this is 2012 through current data with cryoprecipitate use in blue and fibrinogen concentrate use in red. And this November 2nd, 2016 coincides with, which is right where my arrow is there, coincides with the introduction of ROTEM at our institution. So the one thing I can say from the data in these next 3 slides that I'm going to show you is it certainly is having an impact on our fibrinogen usage. Both in the operating room, and the data is down here, it's probably too small to see, but both in the operating room and in the post-operative period, we're seeing fibrinogen replacing cryoprecipitate for better or worse. This is liver transplant patients specifically, and this is blood product utilization during the operative period with red cells in red, frozen plasma in yellow, platelets in orange, cryo in green, and fibrinogen concentrate in purple here, both pre and post introduction of ROTEM. And you can't really say very much at all about these data, I don't think. I'm really hoping that our frozen plasma utilization is going down, but that's a little early to say. But certainly our fibrinogen consumption is significant. And similarly in the post-operative period, so this is in the first 12 or 24 hours post-operatively, we're seeing a similar trend. So I'm going to wrap up there. I have a few thank yous. I want to say thank you to both our transfusion medicine teams and our hematology teams at Vancouver General. You can imagine that implementing a program like this that is centralized is a huge, huge job that has been brilliantly carried out by both our hematology and transfusion medicine sides at VGH. Both Cecilia Lee at PBCO and Lawrence Sham at VGH who provided me with some of this data. And then we had a very large multidisciplinary ROTEM working group and implementation team that consisted of some of the folks in the lab, including Dr. Tyler Smith, who's here, and then some of my clinical colleagues from trauma surgery, ICU, and anesthesia, and some of the folks that helped bring this to fruition. Questions?
Questions? Team,
While we're waiting, maybe I'll just go first. Mark Yeager from University of Pittsburgh. You know, I'm not familiar with that Victor Ferrara's study, but I'm from the one you presented earlier at the beginning of the talk, but I'm familiar with a bunch of his others, and they were retrospective reviews of large anesthesia and surgery databases. And so what the problem with these studies is you don't actually have a lot of detail on the patients, and so the conclusion that we're left with is that transfusions are bad. I'm going, you know, the transfusions, that's a South Park joke. That's a TV show that comes on TV. That's a thing that goes on the wall, you turn on and you get entertained. Okay. So what we're left with is this idea that transfusions kill people, right? But there's something called confounding by indication.
I'm not going to argue for a moment about this with you, just so you know ahead of time before you. I'm with you.
So I just wanted to tell everyone else then that who might not be, this idea that the reason that the transfusion was given is what causes the outcome. So it looks like transfusions are causing people to die, but the reason that the transfusion was given is often the reason that they end up dying. And you can't tease this out in a large retrospective study. You know, so when you see these graphs that show mortality going up with the number of red cells going up, you can say, well, look, 10 red cells, 50% mortality. Red cells kill people, right? Yes. Or the reason why they needed the 10 red cells is what's killing people. So when you see these graphs, they're hypothesis generating, I think. but it doesn't prove that red cells kill people or
Yeah,
are
no, I
bad.
totally agree with you. There's a huge amount of data out there that's messy, and all it can be is hypothesis generating. I think there's an intriguing amount of data that shows us that unnecessary transfusions are at least not doing any good. So I think that is what has sort of driven all of the interest in subsequent studies, et cetera. But I agree with you, it's hard to interpret.
Thanks. That's really interesting to me. I haven't seen that sort of thing before. But what's the difference between cryoprecipitate and fibrinogen concentrate? I thought cryoprecipitate has a lot of fibrinogen in it. And like head to head, what's the difference in fibrinogen content? And would cryo be as effective? Or my second question is there a correlation between the fibrinogen level and that part of the ROTEM that shows the fibrinogen, your pink part of the ROTEM? So in centers that don't have ROTEM, can they monitor that by fibrinogen level, for example?
So cryo, I would imagine it depends a little bit on the blood center or the blood supplier, but the fibrinogen content within cryoprecipitate is variable and obviously measured. And I would say for 10 units of cryo, which is in many places a standard adult dose, it's between 2 and 4 grams of fibrinogen. And then your fibrinogen concentrate obviously is given on a gram per gram basis. Cryoprecipitate has other things in it of questionable utility, pro or con. So, things like factor VIII and von Willebrand factor and fibronectin and people sort of have theoretic arguments at length about whether those things are good or bad, and I don't know the answer to that. There is one Canadian, I think maybe even more than Canadian, multi-center study now looking at fibrinogen concentrate versus cryoprecipitate in cardiac surgery, and Canada will be one of the only places that can do that because there are a lot of places that don't have cryo in Europe, for example. I think that the answer is we don't know, and you would be just as right or wrong with the retrospective lens to choose one or the other at this point, and some places are even automatically substituting one for the other depending on their shop. There have been a number of studies that have looked at Klaus fibrinogen assays and have correlated their results with the ROTEM, so that it measures the A10 on the FibTem in ROTEM, and have shown a reasonable correlation, though I can say that doesn't always hold. We haven't done it on our data set yet because there's just not enough data there yet, I think, to be meaningful. The trends are similar. So you could use the fibrinogen assay to follow for certain, and this observation that patients need fibrinogen replacement during the anhepatic phase of liver transplantation was obvious with fibrinogen levels before we had ROTEM, for sure.
And it wasn't really a question so much, Jackie, as a comment, which is I think that your hematology colleagues in Canada owe you a thank you for your ability to replace cryo with fibrinogen. From the blood operator perspective, any whole blood donation that we have to make cryo out of cannot be used to make a platelet. And so the kind of ongoing fussing in the country about periodic platelet challenges is what you're doing helps make that better.
Hi. FibTem is done by administering cytokeratin D into the cup, and so that inhibits the platelets, which means I'm assuming you were showing XTEM for the comparison.
XTEM on the left, FibTem on the right.
Yeah. So the difference between XTEM and FibTem would be the platelet contribution, and I noticed that in some it looked like your XTEM width was going down, whereas your FibTem width was increasing, so it suggests that platelets were coming down. Have you been looking at that over time and to see what the platelet contribution is doing?
So we, the one hole I think that is quite rightly maybe this is what you're getting at, is that if you, in our current system, is if you identify that you have a fibrinogen problem, you cannot rule out that you also have a platelet problem. And we, historically, in some of the trials that we've been involved with, we've combined this test with Platelet Works, which is just one of many platelet function assays, which has been helpful, particularly in the context of cardiac surgery, but we don't have that technology at the moment. So the only thing we're doing is, as we've always done, is we have platelet count and we have history.
So why not just use the difference between the XTEM and the FibTEM?
Yeah, you could.
Because
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, I've never really, yeah, I've not thought about it that way, to be honest.
Because there's a lot of studies that show that there's not good correlation between platelet count and platelet function in trauma patients because there's a certain amount of platelet inhibition that happens before they even arrive.
Yeah.
Sorry, just one more quick question. Sorry, yeah. So I think in theory you can look at platelets and the coagulation factors, but you're not directly looking at the platelets. You're relying on a conventional platelet count, or?
We only have a conventional, this and a conventional platelet count at the moment, yeah.
Right, okay. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay.
Okay. I didn't call you yet, Mark. Where are you going?
Just keep going.
Don't just. I'm not ready for you. Okay, Mark Yazer hardly needs an introduction. He's a regular CBR speaker. We keep inviting him back. Maybe he'll get it right. Mark graduated from the University of Ottawa in medical school, then trained in heme path at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, and now and then left. He is currently I'm not sure what happened there. He's currently a professor of pathology at the University of Pittsburgh, medical director of the Red Cell Serology Lab at the Centralized Transfusion Service in Pittsburgh. He serves in a whole bunch of leading capacities for the AABB and a variety of other things. He leads a highly successful research program with interests in blood management, blood utilization, and trauma, and a variety of other. He dallies and all kinds of stuff. So he's always a welcome person to have here to instruct us. Okay, Mark, you're on.
Hi. It's nice to be back. I think I actually hold the record for the greatest number of appearances at the Norman Bethune meeting. So I must be doing something right, or they're doing something wrong. We'll see in 20 minutes. But I want to tell a quick story about Norman Bethune and the symposium. So years ago, I gave a talk, and then shortly thereafter, I was talking to my mom, right? No, how's the sister? How's my grandmother? Blah, blah, blah. She says, boy, I'd never realized what a problem volume overload was after transfusion. Huh? Where did that come from? She says, yeah, didn't you know that talk you gave in Vancouver is online, and I've watched it, your dad's watched it, your grandmother's watched it, everyone's watched it. So when you look at the specs about who's watching these things, if you see a huge peak in Southern Ontario, sadly, it's probably just my mom. Where's the donations? Yeah, well, say it louder, she'll hear you, because she'll probably be watching this too. So, you know, it is kind of embarrassing to be talking about whole blood and as a champion of whole blood, and we're doing great stuff with the whole blood. But as we heard earlier, I mean, this is nothing new, right? This is the way it used to be. And like fashion, everything comes back around. And so we have a situation like that as well in trauma, blood product resuscitation. So I have to let you know about these things. A little bit of a tie-up with Terumo. Terumo makes the bags that we use to produce our leuko-reduced whole blood. So, you know. And this talk comes from a review that we have in transfusion medicine. If you're interested in it, just let me know and I'll be happy to send it to you. So whole blood, it's pretty straightforward. It is literally what comes from the vein of the donor. We don't manufacture it into components. We just add a little bit of red cell preservative and sugar, and we leave it for 21 days. So there's nothing to it, right? This is the easiest transfusion you can give because it's as close to vein as you can get without having to make any manipulations to it. And there are two kinds of whole blood. Basically, we have the warm whole blood, which you've probably heard about in the Army when the medevac helicopter is hours away and the soldier's injured and his ABO-compatible colleagues take a unit of blood, it's warm, and transfuse it to him. That's not FDA approved. That's not something we can routinely do in the hospital. I should say at all do in the hospital. So today we'll be talking about cold stored whole blood where a qualified donor makes a donation, it's tested, etc. And these are the units that we're giving to our patients. Whole blood is a really straightforward idea. Obviously the slide came from a surgeon because it's obviously a very simple, straightforward conception of a complicated process. But he says, look, are you going to send your kid to school with some apple juice and some applesauce and some vitamins? Or are you just going to give them a bloody apple? Yeah? And I think it makes a lot of sense because we know in trauma these patients are going to get a lot of products. And so early on, at least in the resuscitation, whole blood makes an awful lot of sense to administer to our patients. And there are many different advantages to whole blood, primarily the fact that it's got a higher hematocrit and higher concentration of clotting factors than reconstituting a unit of whole blood with plasma, platelets, and red cells because it doesn't have all that extras saline and red cell and anticoagulant fluid in it that you would if you put it back together with components. So you can see here that fresh whole blood, it's going to be a little more dilute and have a slightly lower hematocrit than whole blood because we have to put a bit of CPD in. That's just the way it is. But it's going to have a lot less CPD and stuff compared to reconstituting that unit from the components themselves. So it's more concentrated. You can put it in a bag. It's one bag. You know how to store it already. We know how to put red cells on helicopters and ship them off. Why not put a whole blood unit? Patient's going to get some platelets. Patient's going to get some plasma. I think it's the ideal pre-hospital resuscitation fluid. And it's not a new idea, right? We've seen this slide before. Many people didn't realize this was one of the earliest Pokemon characters. Jean-Baptiste Denis had the card of this Pokemon. So it was obviously a whole blood transfusion going on in the early days, although that's all they knew about. They didn't know to separate it into components. The centrifuge wasn't invented then. Other examples, we heard about the Battle of Cambrai earlier today. Many soldiers were transfused. 20 got some whole blood and half of them survived. Obviously, they survived because of the whole blood. Never mind confounding by indication. That's not here at all. They definitely survived because of the whole blood transfusion, for sure. I'm kidding. The American military was all up on whole blood as well. They used a lot of it towards the end of the Korea conflict and throughout the Vietnam. They were using low titer Group O whole blood, which is exactly what we use now as well. We'll talk more about that. And when you read their literature and talk to them, they didn't see any transfusion reactions. Hundreds of thousands of red cell units transfused without transfusion reaction. Okay. The Israelis, who are no shortage or no stranger to conflict, also used whole blood in their 1973 war. They were using untitered units of whole blood, so they didn't titer the anti-A and the anti-B. And again, they also report no hemolytic reactions, and they stick to that even to this day. Now, perhaps one of the most important conflict situations that you might come into contact with locally was 2 weeks ago when your Vancouver Whitecaps lost to the championship runners-up, TFC, my boys, Toronto FC, right? This is why I ended up in Pittsburgh, I think, is my undying support for Toronto in Western Canada, but not the Maple Leafs, that's for sure. So, I don't know, did you get a big spike in trauma after this game, from all the anger that went on? Isn't that what happens when Vancouver teams lose sports games, right? Hey, listen, it's the same thing happened in Toronto when they won the World Series too in 91 and 92. They trashed the city. It's a strangely Canadian thing, isn't it? Our teams win, hooray, let's destroy our cities. Yeah. I'm going to leave that alone. Whole blood is really well, and here we, trauma situation. So, whole blood is perfectly suited to this damage control resuscitation idea. This is a newer concept of how to deal with traumatically injured patients. It's been introduced over the past 10 years or so. basically a whole lot of surgical things that are done, and as it intersects in our world, you can see massive transfusion protocols are an important part of providing a lot of blood early in the resuscitation so that these patients can be managed. And again, another slide that comes from a surgeon, very simple slide. The way they like to think of trauma resuscitation is if it's clear, it's bad, and if it's yellow, it's fantastic. This is the stuff. Is it platelets? Give us more. Is it plasma? We'll take it. But if it's clear, don't do it at all. Now, we have Ed here. Ed, we all know, is the #1 Norman Bethune fan, right? No one else knows about Norman Bethune like Ed Conway, except possibly for my friend and supplier of the last 2 slides, Lieutenant Colonel Andy Beckett. Andy Beckett is a physician, surgeon for the Canadian Army, and also in McGill in Montreal. He's such a fan of Norman Bethune that he tracked down the house where Bethune lived in Montreal and continually makes offers to buy the house. He wants to live where Bethune lived, which is pretty cool if you think about it, right? I mean, how often do you get a chance not only to meet your heroes, but to live in their house? You know, and I said, well, why don't you try to track down his old car? But it turns out in Montreal it was some beater Ford, so yeah, he's got a Mini. So yeah, Ed, you are #1, and #1A, I think, is Lieutenant Colonel Andy Beckett. So what's with this plasma? What's the idea of whole blood? What's the advantage of giving whole blood, right? Well, when the traumatically injured patient comes to your emergency room, you don't know anything other than that he's traumatically injured, right? But we do know that a lot of patients who are traumatically injured and will go on to develop or go on to require massive transfusion, which in this study was 10 units of red cells in 24 hours, they're coagulopathic when they come. Look at the INR 2.0, yeah, and climbing. Patients who are massively injured have a problem, right? And they're often coagulopathic. They often need some plasma early in the resuscitation so we don't get behind. We don't get this bad day for our anesthesia colleagues with vascular permeability, etc. We want to know who these patients are as quickly as we can. And although ROTEM and TEG give us this information, it's not immediate. It's not when the patient comes, or better yet, when the patient is en route to the hospital in the ambulance or in the helicopter. So intervening early with some plasma is a really good idea, and whole blood allows us to do that, along with the red cells that the patient is bleeding and some platelets as well. So that's part of the idea for whole blood resuscitation. We keep it in the refrigerator, which makes it very easy to use, right? We all know how to put red cells in the refrigerator, put a whole blood unit in there too. We know how to transport them. It's all very straightforward. You know, surely the ideal pre-hospital resuscitation fluid. And I'm not supposed to tell you that we did pretty well on a grant, and we will maybe, hopefully, get funding for our project trial of putting whole blood in helicopters and using that as a resuscitation fluid. So not just red cells, not just plasma, but whole blood as well. So we're very keen. Hopefully we get that money, because I think it'll do a world of good for traumatically injured patients. You know, questions that we can ask about whole blood are, well, you know, are the clotting factor levels maintained? And, you know, as we heard earlier from Dr. Pidcock this morning about the cold platelets, how do they work as well? Well, here's an easy study that uses the same Terumo filter. It's a platelet-sparing leukoreduction filter to leukoreduce whole blood. And what these guys did was they leukoreduced a whole bunch of whole blood units, and they didn't freeze the plasma. They kept the plasma in the liquid state, and they compared the factor levels, you can see there, to apheresis plasma that had been frozen and thawed. And you can see before the storage, which means effectively just after thawing of the apheresis plasma, that the levels of the factors were very comparable. But you know, and as time went by on day 14, you can see the levels of some of these factors went down. Levels of factor 8, factor 5 went down a little bit, but they're very well preserved over time. It's not a problem to store whole blood over time because these factors are well preserved. And you'll notice factor 8 is quite low in some of these units, but that's all right. If you're a hemophiliac, we're not going to resuscitate you with plasma. We're going to resuscitate you with you know, factor 8 clotting factor. But as far as the preservation of these levels go, perfect. We can store whole blood from the clotting factor perspective for many, many days. And the platelets as well. You know, like I say, we heard quite elegantly from Heather this morning about how well whole blood platelets or cold platelets perform in vitro tests. You know, what we need to know is does this excellent performance in the lab translate to excellent performance in the hospital. In patients, we don't know that yet, but all the evidence that we have, all of the good evidence we have in vitro, suggests that we should be testing this theory in actual patients. And so, obviously, we don't know the answer yet, but it looks good for cold stored whole blood platelets. So here's an idea, right? What do we do with platelets? Do we put them on the shelf and leave them? No, we have to agitate them, right? Promotes gas exchange, does all these things. And so, should we be rocking our whole blood? My whole blood's going to have a unit of platelets in it. Should we rock the whole blood? It's not the way we treat red cells. Red cells want to be left alone. Just let them chill on the shelf for 42 days. So what should we do with the whole blood? Well, this is the question we asked. So we took whole blood, divided it into 4 daughter units. 1 unit was not rocked. 3 were rocked in different ways with different agitation methods, and 1 was manually massaged by a summer student. And we measured... Oh, good, you found that funny. Then you might find this funny, too. So the way she rocked the units was she took them and she just went, she just did a massage thing like that, right? You try and explain in writing this motion. You try and write that in a methods section. I said it was like giving a handshake. I couldn't believe it, that I was relieved of anything. What are you thinking? Oh, it's like a handshake. So look what happens. You can see there's no difference. If you want to rock your units, there's no difference in hemolysis until day 21, when a couple of the rocking mechanisms had a little bit higher hemolysis than the unrocked unit. So if you really, really want to rock your whole blood, you have to buy a refrigerator that has a plug on the inside, not cheap. Plug in your agitator and then rock away. So we really didn't want to have to do this, right? So we managed to measure the thromboelastogram, which is similar to the ROTEM that we just heard about, gives you similar kind of information. And as it relates to the platelets, this thing called the maximum amplitude in the top right-hand corner is what gives us platelet information. And you can see compared to the unrocked platelets, platelets that were rocked in any of the mechanical or manual ways had no change. There was no difference in the maximum amplitude in any of these parameters. And so we were very pleased when we got this information, because it meant we didn't have to rock our platelets, or our whole blood. We could just let it chill in the fridge by itself. So, by the way, for the American colleagues that are here, this is ice hockey. Yeah? Sport that's played in Canada, and I would say perfected in Canada. Yeah? I think we can all agree to that. So this is how we do it in Pittsburgh. As a matter of fact, that is how we do it in Pittsburgh, because that's Sidney Crosby scoring goal number 2 in the Olympics. But this is how we do whole blood for adults in Pittsburgh. So we started this in December of 2014, and at the time it was only for males, because we only wanted to have O-positive whole blood. We didn't want to have a whole smorgasbord of products in our ED refrigerator. So it's just for males, O-positive whole blood. We had 2 O-positive whole blood units in the refrigerator in the Emerge for immediate use. We had 2 more in the blood bank that could be issued as well. We started off using only 2 units of whole blood. That was the maximum, but we have some safety data that showed it was fine, so we upped that to 4 units. I'll show you that in a minute. And the idea here is that when these 4 units of whole blood are being transfused, we're getting our point of care testing, we're getting our TEG, we're getting our up-to-date information on the patient's coagulation status, and then the transfusions that we give are tailored to what the patient is missing. Like I say, the whole blood itself, it's always O-pos, because we're still only using this for adult males. We do leukoreduce it, and you might wonder, there is evidence that shows leukoreduction is superfluous in trauma patients. It doesn't provide an extra benefit. But we thought if this was really going to catch on, then leukoreduction is becoming the way of the times. It's becoming de rigueur in USA, so we thought if this is really going to start to work, probably at some point we'll be all leukoreduced anyway in USA. So we're using this leukoreduction filter. Interestingly, we have to titer both the anti-A and the anti-B. We use low titer units. We picked a titer of less than 50. Ask me where the number came from. Ask me where we got 50 from, right? The air. It just... We wanted to have a number that our transfusion committee would like, right? We didn't want to have this turned down, so we said, look, we're going to use 50, or in Pittsburgh, 50. I kid you not. So we're going to use 50. We have about 20% failure rates, so 20% of our donors have an A or B titer higher than that, but it's still no problem for us to get these units. They're all male donors because of the trolley risk mitigation that we have to do. We used to tell the nurses in the Emerge 1 time per shift you have to get out the unit and give it a handshake. But after we saw our data, we realized it didn't change the MA, it didn't change the TEG results, so we told them to stop doing it, and it was a major relief for them because they weren't doing it anyway. So they don't have to feel bad about. They don't have to feel bad about not following the policy. And what we do is we leave it for 14 days, right? And then if the unit of whole blood isn't used for 14 days, on day 15 we get it back, we spin it, now we have an O positive red cell that we can sell and recuperate some of our money. So at least we can get some of the cash back. So now is going to come a whole bunch of numbers. This is when we compared some of our early data, 46 whole blood treated patients to 96 male trauma patients who received uncross-matched units in the emergency, so very similar to the whole blood patients. And you can see that there was really no statistically significant difference between these two. The length of stay in the ICU was a little bit shorter, but I don't think that's real because the patient numbers weren't high enough. And so at least what we weren't getting, it was a signal to show us that the whole blood was bad. We weren't getting any indication that what we were doing was worse for the patients. And when we look at their 24-hour blood product utilization, this is up-to-date stuff you're seeing hot off the press, 159 whole blood treated patients compared to 145 component treated patients, again males in the ER who are getting blood. You can see there's a little bit of a reduction in the red cell and plasma transfusion numbers, but we don't have a rigorous transfusion policy for products in the emerge. We don't have each surgeon does what they want. And so, again, it's not worse for the whole blood patients. They're not like they're taking more products in 24 hours. If anything, they're taking fewer products, and that gives us safety information. And some people get really hung up on these ratios. Wow, some people love their ratios, boy oh boy. So if you want to know, 159 whole blood patients have a ratio of a red cell to plasma ratio of greater than 1. Lots of plasma comes to these patients with whole blood, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you're not getting a lot of products in the first place, then getting a whole blood unit gives you automatically this 1-to-1 ratio. So some people really like that. And the platelet to red cell ratio too, also much higher than patients who were just being resuscitated with component therapy. So, because a lot of times surgeons forget about the platelets, but with whole blood, you can't forget because it's already built in. Now this is what you want to know. Are the patients hemolyzing? Not everyone's going to be group O in trauma. There's going to be some other blood groups mixed in there. We're giving them all O whole blood. It's going to have anti-A, anti-B in there. Are they hemolyzing? So we compared 27 group O, non-O, whole blood recipients to 17 group O whole blood recipients who are not going to hemolyze. You can see demographically they look A-OK. Interestingly, and again, this probably gets back to the fact that we don't have a standard transfusion policy for patients. Surgeons do what they want with the trauma patients. The non-O recipients receive 3 times more red cells and higher numbers of platelets than the group O whole blood recipients. And I don't know why, because when you look at their trauma indicators, they were pretty similar. It probably just gets down to surgeon preference and how they do it. But the real key here is, are they hemolyzing? So, no. Have a look at the haptoglobin here. If patients were hemolyzing, you'd expect the haptoglobin to be low or unmeasurable. But the red line is not significantly lower than the black line, which tells us the patients weren't having extra hemolysis from receipt of the group O whole blood units, and you wouldn't really expect that because they're only getting 2 units each. What about the bilirubin? Well, here you can see that the non-group O recipients had higher, statistically higher bilirubin than the group O whole blood recipients, but it's still within the normal range. And you can see by the next day that significance has disappeared. So they're not hemolyzing from this. And we looked at also and of course the other thing to remember, of course, is that the group O whole blood recipients got 3 times more red cells, 3 times more, hemolysis just from getting red cells. The red cells that die are going to give you a little bit of extra bilirubin. And so we think that's probably the explanation for that, not from active ongoing hemolysis. And the LDH you can see is through the roof. But that's because we don't discriminate LDH based on the tissue it comes from. So you'd expect this to be quite elevated. And the 2, again, were not significantly different. No problems with kidney function either. So that's great news. Such good news, in fact, that when we went to the pediatric, actually it's not what happened. We went initially to the peds group. We said, look, we're doing whole blood for adult trauma. Would you like to try some whole blood in pediatric trauma? Oh, did they laugh. It's like I told the best joke of my life. Those pediatric trauma patients, trauma physicians wanted nothing to do with our whole blood. Okay, then what happens? They all went to a conference, and somebody was at the conference talking about the benefits of giving whole blood. Suddenly my cell phone rings. It's one of the anesthesiologists saying, do we do this whole blood in Pittsburgh? Because the guy on the podium is saying we do whole blood in Pittsburgh. Why aren't we doing this at the Children's Hospital? I'm like, don't you remember that great joke I told where you were all like keeled over laughing, you know? So anyway, the past was forgotten, and we do whole blood at our Children's Hospital as well. You can see we started that just last year, so we don't have a lot of patients. And because of that, we wanted to use O-negative red cells, O-negative whole blood rather, so we can include the male and the female trauma patients, because luckily there aren't a lot of pediatric traumas, so we got to catch them all, so we have to use O-negative whole blood. We just recently upped the maximum dose from 20 to 30 mLs per kilo based on some safety data, but we don't use it for patients less than 3 because we want their adult ABO levels to be expressed so that they can absorb any of these antibodies that might cause hemolysis. 1 unit of whole blood in the fridge, 1 unit of whole blood in the blood bank, and we're doing the same thing, TEG, ROTEM, to get more up-to-date information on these patients after they get the whole blood. That, by the way, was my Mini Cooper on the receiving end of a failed stop by a Jeep driver. 13 patients. 13 patients have received whole blood, yeah? At the Children's Hospital, you can see 7 non-Os, they're all group As, and 6 were group O, 7 females and 6 males, you know, and there's some other fun facts that you can look at. But here's what you really want to know, I didn't do any statistics on these numbers because the number of patients is very small, but you can see, just eyeballing it, doesn't look like there's much of a difference in the transfusion numbers that were given to the pediatric patients. And are they hemolyzing? No. Look at it, it's even better than it is in the adults, right? The haptoglobin is in normal range, albeit at the lower limit. Bilirubin's normal, LDH isn't as high. So this looks terrific. And are they having any troubles with the kidneys, maybe from some free hemoglobin? No way, not on. So we do this for adults, we do this for children, and we haven't had any problems. Now I want to show a beautiful sunset from Mount Masada in the morning, looking out east over the mountains of Jordan, while we transition quickly to the bonus part of this talk, which no one expected, so everyone is nervous. But I want to tell you about this study that just came out in Transfusion because it's cool, right? So we've been talking about giving patients incompatible blood, right? This was unheard of, right? We're giving someone a group O whole blood unit. It's going to have a full, would you give a unit of O plasma to an A recipient? No, you wouldn't do that. No, of course not. That's ludicrous. That violates everything Landsteiner talked about. Or does it? So the excellent Nancy Dunbar and I did a study with the BEST Collaborative where we just asked the question of American Level 1 trauma centers, do you give A plasma in trauma to patients whose ABO group you don't know? And look what the answers were. Yes, as a matter of fact, many of the sites, 62% of them, will give it in an unlimited manner. You know, we have a patient, we don't have enough AB plasma, just give them some A. Chances are they're going to be A or O, no problem. And most of them don't even bother titering the anti-B. They just give out the A plasma. So we asked the question, is this a problem, right? Is giving group A plasma in a trauma situation to B and AB recipients where it will be incompatible, causing them to die more than patients who are getting A plasma and who are group A themselves? So identical versus obviously not identical groups. And we called it the STAT study. Hurry up and give us the plasma STAT. STAT study. Do you see what we did? It's good like that, yeah. It's clear. So primary outcome was, it's a retrospective study, right? So primary and secondary outcomes, it's not so right. But we powered it for overall survival. Did the patients get out of the hospital any more than they were predicted to by the TRIS score? And we did some secondary outcomes as well. And you can see that the patients were very well matched with their gender, their age, and the TRIS score, which is a measure of prediction of survival in trauma. So higher numbers, the better. By the way, you might be wondering what the Montreal Canadiens logo is doing there. And it should be clear that I just wanted to show you the logo of a team that actually makes the playoffs. Might be my last time at the Bethune conference, eh? Oh, I'm seeing some nasty looks too. Well, too bad. So what are the results, right? Don't forget, we have given A plasma to all kinds of incompatible recipients. We should be killing them, right? No. Look, the survival to discharge and in-hospital death, not even close to being different. We looked at length of stay in the hospital. We looked at early mortality. We could not find a difference between the two patients that are getting obviously incompatible and compatible plasma. And, you know, we know that there could be some subtle morbidity going on. Maybe there's some subtle kidney problems or something else that's going on because of this plasma that we didn't measure. We were just asking the question, are we killing them? The answer is no, we're not. So the conclusion was basically, we're not killing them. We don't have enough AB plasma. Keep going. Basically, just do it. So in conclusion, it's very feasible to do whole blood for civilian trauma. We did it. You can do it. We really ought to be putting this stuff on helicopters. It is the ideal resuscitation fluid. If you're going to give them a red cell, they probably need some plasma too, at least early in the resuscitation until we can get our point of care testing. We do it only for trauma patients for now, but that's going to be expanding. And there's no harm in using A plasma. Would you put your money in this bank? The Koreans do, but I don't know. Cheers, and thanks again very much.
Questions, comments? Andrew, you have a mic.
First of all, Mark, great talk, and thank you so much for presenting the STAT study. When this was presented at AB Best, I think it was really enough to move the needle at VGH to try to move to A plasma in our massive transfusion protocols. In regards to your talk about whole blood, the two questions I had was, one, do you think leukoreduction is more or less important when it comes to whole blood versus component therapy? And the second question I have is, how did you decide on the sort of the storage duration for your whole blood?
So with respect to leukoreduction, there is evidence that it doesn't benefit trauma patients. It doesn't harm them, but it doesn't benefit them. And we're just working with Phil Spinella in St. Louis on a big study looking at in vitro parameters of platelets and coagulation for leukoreduced and non-leukoreduced whole blood. And the results, as a bit of a preview, are a bit of a mixed bag. And so I don't think it's necessary to leukoreduce whole blood based on our in vitro and more importantly the clinical trials of trauma patients. But like I say, the reason why we did it was because we've seen the future, and the future is just like it is here, leukoreduced for everybody in USA, and we wanted to make sure that we could implement that if we had to. So we started off with a view to the future. That's leukoreduction. Tell me again what the second question was.
How did you decide on your storage duration for whole blood?
Well, do you see the stuff all around us, right? We just, you know, again, we couldn't afford to do it for 5 days. We couldn't afford to have whole blood turning over every 5 days. And there was evidence, mostly from Heather's study, from transfusion, that showed platelet function was well maintained for 14 days, at least in vitro. And so we thought, you know, if we get the unit back on day 15, we'll have a week to use an O unit, an O red cell unit that we can sell, and that's no problem. So we basically based it on the limitation of platelet function on around day 14.
I was just wondering if you had a idea why the factor activity in the day 14 and day 28 don't seem to follow a typical decay pattern where kind of half's at day 14 and half of that left at day 28. And is it just maybe factor 5 and 8 because 5 is in platelets too and 8 is with von Willebrand's or other
Well,
things?
the reason why they pick 5 and 8 is these are the traditional factors to pick for quality control of plasma products. They have the shorter half-lives, and so if the shorter half-lives are maintained, then the ones that are longer will be maintained as well. But in terms of why it doesn't decay the way it ought to, I don't know, maybe the cold temperature changes the way it decays, but I have no idea.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Mark.
Cheers.
Thank you. Do you have one of these? Yeah. Okay, we're taking a break before wind up. So coffee, we'll be back at 4 or 4:05 at the latest, and there's lots still to come. All right? All right, Cedric, sit down. Ew. See? That's unbelievable. Nobody else listens to me like that. All right, wow, what quiet. Okay, so first, before I introduce anybody, our next speaker is, I'm just asking, or reminding everybody, please fill out the evaluation forms. There's, or online, there's a link on your programs, and you will probably receive an email in the near future, very near future, to remind you again to please do that, but it has an impact on our decisions. Okay? All right, so our last speaker for the day, Dana Devine. So Dana, don't go away. Dana is, as you all know Dana, she's currently the Chief Medical and Scientific Officer of the Canadian Blood Services, a professor of pathology and lab medicine at the University of British Columbia, founding member of the Center for Blood Research, an editor of Vox Sanguinis, and a member of numerous advisory committees on transfusion medicine throughout the United States and the world, indeed. She completed her research training at Duke, where she specialized in something close to my heart as complement, and but studied, really is a biochemist by training and with interest as well in coagulation. For her many contributions, she has received numerous awards and accolades as a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. I can go on and on and on. I'm really not sure how she does what she does, because she does a ton. All right, so it's really nice to see her, because usually she's flying from here to there to there to there, and yet she does it all. So Dana.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got the wrap-up talk here, and I have the opportunity really to be somewhat speculative, to put on my sort of futurist hat, which I enjoy wearing, and I don't get to wear that often. So I thought that what I try to do is just to set a little bit of a stage for you about some of the current challenges that we face in the blood system in Canada, and then talk about what we think the future opportunities are. And this is intended to put maybe a few seeds for thought in the minds of some of the younger folks in the room who are looking at what you're going to be doing in your career going forward, and whether there are real meaningful problems for society that need to be solved in this space. So this is for Dr. Yazer, just so that you don't think that there's only one person around who puts sports analogies in their talks. I must say, Dr. Yazer, I was getting really nervous there when we got to about slide 6 or so, and no sports logos had shown up. No, and I thought, oh my God, Mark's had an epiphany. I was really glad when they started to show up, because I thought I had wasted this slide. So this is, I'm originally from Boston, and I'm a Red Sox fan, and it hurt me a lot to put a picture of a Yankee in a slide, but he had wonderful quotes. This is Yogi Berra, and he was the one who said, "The future ain't what it used to be." So with that setting, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about some of the challenges that are currently facing Canada's blood system. One of these was alluded to by some of our other speakers, and that is the focus that we've started to get on how to keep patients from being transfused. We must be about the only sort of industry that you can think of that's actively trying to get rid of its business. We're doing a pretty good job of it. What you see here is a measure that we often use for comparing the transfusion rates in a country, and that is the number of units of red cells that are transfused per 1,000 population. Canada had historically been pretty low on this score. So what's the scale look like? The scale looks like, probably 6 or 7 years ago, it would have been about 69 in Denmark, which was the lead country. The US was running in the mid-40s. And patient blood management came to us. We started to see data which suggested that if you had your patient in better shape before they went into the surgery and they would not need to be transfused, you had a better outcome at the end. And so you started to see the impact on the amount of blood that was used in countries. So Canada and there was an effect on PBM for us, but not as big as it was elsewhere. So, for example, the U.S. is now down in the mid-30s. This is seen in the last 5 or 6 years about a 30% decline in the number of units of red cells sold in the U.S. And Dr. Yaser could probably wax poetic about the impact that has on business models in countries that rely on sales of blood. It's a little bit different here. We are unusual in this country in that we are directly block funded by governments for operating the blood system, the 2 blood systems in Canada. Canadian Blood Services covering the country with the exception of Quebec, which has its own blood system. What you can see here, however, is that our use of red cells in this country is starting to stabilize. So we don't really think that it's going to change much. These data are not actually current, and the most current data that I've seen would suggest that we've essentially plateaued for red cells, so we don't think we're going to go much lower, and that gives us some other things to think about. One of the things we need to think about is trying to meet the demand for specific groups of red cells. And so this is a big challenge for us. We always have hospitals wanting more O-negative red cells than we can easily acquire from donors in Canada. What does that look like? Well, approximately 7% of the Canadian population is O-neg. And yet, if you look at the percentage of our issues of red blood cells to Canadian hospitals, it's hovering somewhere between 11 and 12 for the most part. So this means that the demand for those sets of blood groups greatly exceeds their actual distribution in the population. What does that actually mean? Well, that means that O-negative donors are having to donate quite frequently relative to the other blood groups that are represented in our blood donor pool. Canada has one of the highest rates of donations per year per donor of any of the high development index countries. So we are starting to recognize that we're probably bleeding our donors too often, and we need to grow the size of the donor pool. The other thing that is challenging for Canada's blood system is the demand for AB plasma. It's interesting to hear that the community is sort of looking to replace AB plasma with A plasma for certain applications. I also think we all need to sit back and look at why we're ordering and using so much AB plasma, because a whole lot of it goes to patients who didn't need it in the first place. And there are some inventory management practices we probably could tackle before we actually jumped to automatically using A plasma. But this is just an example of what we're seeing in Canada. About 1/3 of the Canadian population is group AB, so this is the rare blood group. CBS, because we know there's high demand for this plasma, we curry favor with AB people, and we've managed to get the percentage of CBS donors up to 4%. However, you can see the percentage of AB plasma issues out of our total plasma issues is heading into the mid-teens. So we have to do something about this. We have to figure out how to do a better job of managing AB plasma. So these are some challenges for inventory and some places to think about ideas for doing things differently from what we do now. So I'd like to talk specifically about some bigger and broader, more futuristic types of things to consider. And I don't have a perfectly focused crystal ball, which is why this photograph is actually slightly out of focus itself. But I'd like to talk about the following things that are up here on the slide. I want to talk about the development and the impact of smart systems and what they might mean in transfusion medicine. Talk a bit about big data and analytics, personalized medicine, cellular therapies, alternative blood products, some of which we've heard a bit about today. Talk a bit about donors, because that's really important. They're the raw material for all of this. And then speak a bit about structured decision making, because the policies that we create around blood and blood use have a big downstream impact on everything else in transfusion medicine. So what are we talking about with smart systems? Well, by smart systems, I'm including the concepts of both artificial intelligence in the sense of machine learning and algorithmic business, which is a process where the IT system is actually making routine business decisions using a set of rules or an algorithm. And in that way, you have greatly reduced human intervention. So there's great application for this in transfusion medicine. You can think of places one might use that, where you might have automated changes to daily blood production targets for a blood operator that's based on predicted hospital demand. So this is information that can be acquired on an ongoing basis electronically and used for sort of automated, just fix the system and let it run more smoothly, instead of having a bunch of people, normally, at least in our environment, who are pretty harried, running around with their hair sticking up in different directions, wondering how many units of whatever they're going to be able to find that day. You could also look at this kind of technology application for doing more automated donor assessments, and that might allow us to do something like leveraging a very sophisticated assessment of a donor to do a better job meeting the needs of a specific patient. And then we can also look at something that sounds a little bit mundane, but one of the big costs of operating blood systems is actually the logistics of moving blood around. How do you know where to send trucks and where they go and all this kind of thing? If we could automate that part of the business of running a blood system, it would be very nice. So there's a place for smart systems in there. Big data is a word that we all throw around. What do we mean by big data? Well, in the transfusion medicine context so far, big data has looked like large databases that are full of pieces of information about patients, so these tend to be based in hospitals, or they could be large databases in the blood operator, for example. CBS has a big database all full of pieces of information about donors and pieces of information about the blood products that we make. And the question becomes, can you marry these two things and learn anything? So for those of you who were at the symposium last year, you may recall having heard a talk from investigators from the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, who actually had merged their hospital transfusion outcome database with the database of Canadian Blood Services, just trying to see what you could mine out of that. And they were looking at whether there was an impact of the gender of the donor and the age of the donor on the outcome of the transfusion for the patient, among other variables that they studied. So that's an example of using those sorts of big data. The other piece where big data comes to play is actually looking at very large sets of data that can arise from studying an individual donor or individual patients. So these would be the kinds of analyses that come from doing large genetic analyses on blood donors. And there are some very interesting studies going on right now that are supported by the NIH, being performed by a group called the REDS group, and the acronym is irrelevant to these kinds of studies because it started back in the days when we were worried about HIV transmission. But what these guys are doing are looking at thousands of transfusions and then doing very extensive genetic analysis on donors, trying to see if you can identify the factors that influence transfusion outcome. So being able to mine large data sets, this is what we mean by using big data. And they will inform at least the way we generate hypotheses for doing other research studies. One of the other areas which I personally think is going to have a huge impact on transfusion medicine is the whole development of the area of personalized medicine. So what do we mean by that? So personalized medicine, and surely if you actually spend time in the Center for Blood Research, you can't possibly have missed the concepts of personalized medicine, because a lot of other things going on in the LSI have a personalized medicine overtone. And if any of you have ever gone to hear Dr. Cullis speak, you will know all about personalized medicine. But just for those of you who haven't been exposed to this before, what we're really talking about is the ability to develop patient-specific treatments or activities rather than disease-specific treatments. So this is the idea that the best outcome for you as an individual may need your caregivers to understand things about you personally at a genetic level, or the impact of the environment on your health or lifestyle choices. So this is about really tailoring medical care to you as an individual. The way that this has been expressed to date has been really very interesting. Some things would allow for you to be able to have your tumor, have the gene sequence of your tumor very, very carefully sequenced by Mark O'Mara and his group at the Cancer Agency, and then compared to your genetic information in the parts of your body that don't have the tumor, identify what the tumor-specific genetic elements are, and then go screen through big pharmacology databases to find the drug out there that might actually have an impact on your drug, on your disease, your specific tumor. And in fact, some of those early studies have found drugs which are not normally used to treat cancer that have turned out to be very effective in mitigating cancer treatment. So these are examples of how personalized medicine really interacts with big data to be able to find tailored treatments for people. Well, what might that look like in the transfusion medicine space? Well, we could see easily that the platforms are now available to do high throughput genetic analysis at a reasonable cost, and that eventually the cost will come down even further, and that will allow us to do large-scale donor screening. And we can do that for some of the obvious things we always want to know about donors, including their blood group antigens and their platelet antigens and their transplantation or HLA antigens, and what the kind of genotypes and phenotypes of that are. But it also allows us to create a data set for that donor that we can give to the donor to take to their GP. So as personalized medicine becomes more normalized in the way that we deal with medical care, we are providing something for the donor that's actually a benefit. So they came and donated as an altruistic act to support somebody else, but from the blood system they would get back something which could contribute to their own wellness. Now, that's not entirely altruistic on the part of the blood operator, because obviously our healthy donors are going to stay donors. If our donors turn into patients, they disappear from our world. So there's probably a benefit for everyone eventually in having that kind of a capacity. The other advancement in the personalized medicine space really has to do with whether there's an impact of these personalized medicine approaches to the demand for transfusion products. So if you have different ways to provide individualized treatment that take you away from traditional disease-focused treatments, will we actually see an impact on blood product use? No one knows, but it is a question that we need to bear in mind. And it also might mean that down the road we see that the personalized medicine approaches take us into some space where the blood operators are asked to provide personalized blood products of a different sort than what we're asked to provide now. So this is a very fuzzy part of the crystal ball, but it may mean that down the road there are some really interesting things that blood services and blood operators will start to do because this is where personalized medicine is taking us. We've talked a bit today already about the impact of cellular therapies, and I just wanted to reinforce that. So there has been a really significant investment in cellular therapy research in Canada, and this is something we should be proud of as a country. We're doing pretty well. We're not doing so great in other areas of support for research, but in the stem cell cellular therapy space, we're holding our own, I think. You heard Jamie talk about the facilities that are available across the country. We have actually quite a bit of clean room space for doing cellular therapies work that has been supported by the federal government, which means, thank you to all of you, because that's taxpayer money that has done that. So we have infrastructure, and we have the expertise on the research side, and the question now becomes, can we translate all of that when it starts to become routine clinical practice, or at least more routine than it is now? And that's a place where blood operators may have something to offer, where transfusion medicine may have something to offer. Because we are one of the parts of the hospital system, and as the blood operators in the regulated environment, we're in there getting inspected by Health Canada on the cells, tissues, and organs regs, or the blood regs if you're a hospital blood bank. And we have a different mindset about the kinds of documentation and paperwork and validation processes and all this kind of stuff that you have to go through if you either are preparing a biological drug in the first place, or if you are in a hospital blood bank manipulating that after you have received it. So that sort of skill set is normally not something that you are taught about in the research environment, and it has been a bit lumpy trying to figure out how to take all the neat stuff that's being done in our academic medical centers and turn that into something that Health Canada is comfortable with. And so there is a place for partnership and collaboration that I think transfusion medicine brings to play here. It is, I think, in the cellular therapy space important to recognize, and Jamie did point this out, there are plenty of private operators in this space. So some of the development of some of these things, the CAR T-cell technology was the example that Jamie gave. There are lots of commercial enterprises active in this space. So to think that this would all become kind of public domain stuff is pretty unrealistic. However, I do think there is a role for transfusion medicine to play here. Now, we've heard actually quite a bit about this piece of what I think is our future this morning, and this is maybe our future that's close. It's very near. It's in the maybe it's in a 3 to 5 year sort of horizon scan, and that is these kinds of alternative products. So there is potential for some of these expensive but low-risk alternative blood products in the future. We heard from Peter about the idea that you can grow up tailor-designed platelets for use in diagnostic laboratories. I think that Mohan was quite correct when he said we're quite a long way away from being able to grow up a bag of red cells in a lab and tell the donors they can all go home. I think he's right that he and I will both be long retired before anything, even the 20 milliliter of blood experiment gets done. But that's, people are trying, and that's the important thing. So this is, in some ways, some of these problems are smack dab with the engineers now. The scientists have created enough problems. Now we hand it to the engineers to try to figure out how to make it all cost effective. That's a little bit further away, but in the shorter term, it's really about looking at the alternative therapies that we've heard about today. So cold stored platelets is a good example of that. We also know that we have in the plasma protein space new things coming that look a little bit familiar but are also different and hopefully better for patients. So these would be modifications to IVIGs, certain changes that are being made to recombinant clotting factors that allow them to last longer in the circulation and that sort of thing. So some of these things are here. They're here very recently, but our future is here now for some of those areas. And then the other piece of alternative products that I think we always need to consider in the transfusion space is that there are some things that can be used in place of transfusion. Particularly in the cancer therapy space, where as you've seen from some of the pie charts that were shown earlier this morning, a lot of blood products get used in cancer treatment. And part of that is in response to the fact that the drugs that are used for chemotherapy do really nasty things to your bone marrow, and so your bone marrow can't make all the blood cells that you need, and so transfusion becomes an adjunct therapy for chemo. There are drugs now that are on the marketplace, some of them which even are available in Canada, and these are bone marrow sparing drugs, and they require far less transfusion, if any, for some of these treatments. So we will see a change in the mix of the demand for blood products as these kinds of therapies come into play that don't have that kind of effect on bone marrow. So how about some future focus on donors? Well, we know that the donor that responded to the need for the battlefield soldier is not really the blood donor that's out there today coming into our clinics. And so the blood operators of the world, this is not a Canadian problem, we've all been a little bit slow recognizing that the way that we interact with people by disaster response is not actually effective in a non-wartime period. And so we are all having trouble maintaining our donor bases, getting people to come into clinics. The percentage of the population that is eligible to donate blood is much larger than the percentage of the population that actually donates. And so we're not connecting. We're not connecting with the population. Transfusion still is the most common procedure in a hospital, and we're concerned that if this keeps going on this path, we will not be able to provide the blood and blood products that are required for patients, because we have to figure out how do we connect better with the general public. So there are a lot of things that blood operators are trying to do to actually enhance those connections. We know that some of this is technology-based. People don't want to be phoned at dinner asking to please come donate blood. They would rather have somebody show up with a text message or that kind of access. CBS has recently stood up a process where you can go online if you've been a blood donor at least once. You can now go online and fill out part of your screening questionnaire before you go to a clinic, trying to speed the process up a bit. But all of these ways of increasing our digital profile, our digital footprint, and creating better communication channels with the Canadian public that are eligible to donate is a really important thing that has to get better in the future. As far as donor health is concerned, blood operators, I think, have finally woken up and smelled the coffee that we need to be paying a whole lot more attention to this. We've always said that we're donor advocates, but we haven't really done a very good job of paying attention to aspects of donor health. There certainly is a fair amount of discussion and dialogue, both at the AABB, which, as you know, sets standards that are used all over the world in transfusion medicine, around the frequency with which people donate, the management of a donor's iron stores, and how we have to be more attentive to that than we have been. We also know that as donors are moving around more, that we have concerns around risk of new pathogen introduction, and that usually becomes accompanied by new deferral criteria. So Zika virus last year is a good example of that. We deferred about 2% of the Canadian donor base based on the fact that sometime within the last 21 days you had traveled outside the country to somewhere where you had potential Zika risk. Attitude and behavior is really what I had started to talk about at the beginning, which really is we need to figure out how to connect with people differently. We know that there's an increased individualization of the relationship between the donor and the blood service to whom they are donating, and it's much less influenced by family and peers than it used to be. So it used to be, your parents were blood donors, you were expected to be a blood donor, it was a family obligation sort of thing, and that was kind of automatic donors for the blood operator. The world doesn't work like that anymore, and we need to figure out how to reach people at the individual level rather than expecting someone else to influence them. We also know that there's a lot of things for people to do, aside from walking down the sidewalk, playing games on your cell phone, tripping over things at the intersection, which I saw earlier today when I went out at lunchtime briefly. There are lots of competition for people to be able to exercise their need to do something altruistic. And so there are many other charitable activities that one can get engaged in besides donating blood, and we need to recognize that in this modern time, and we do not have the pressure of war and the pictures of fellow citizens dying in theater, that there's not much of a connection. So we're in competition, basically, with other charitable organizations. And then there's a whole interesting political piece, which I won't go into because it's a whole another half-hour talk on its own, which is all of the issues that we're going through in this country right now around the public perception of paying for plasma donors versus voluntary non-remunerated donation. So these are issues that become important in terms of defining the donor base. And then the last piece I'd like to talk about is decision-making for blood safety. We've made a lot of kooky decisions in this industry over the years, mostly in trying to make sure that there was zero risk because we thought that's what the population demanded of us. We spent a lot of money doing that, and not all of it has been for any obvious benefit. So there's lots of changes that are going on. I don't really have time to go through these in detail, and we have had previous speakers, at least last year, who talked a bit about some of this. But we need to be applying a risk-based decision-making framework where we actually make logical decisions with input from the science that we know, from any stakeholder viewpoints that need to be considered, and try to get to the best decision at the end, and hopefully bring some consistency to that process. So some parts of our future are here today. We've already heard about a collection of these things today in the talks, which was partly why the program was designed the way it was. And I hope that some of what you've heard today has been inspiring and will get you back to your home place, and you will need your tarot cards to figure out what your actual future holds. So thanks very much. The answer is always I don't know, because it's all future directed.
Comments, questions?
So I'm kind of curious if you can give us any insights into what you're looking at for increasing donor retention and outreach. We kind of mentioned maybe moving towards text-based or other social media ones. I was wondering if you had any specifics at what CBS is looking at.
Yeah, right now the main focus is looking on the actual experience of the donor in the clinic, because we do see that there's a high proportion of people who come in and donate once, and then they don't come back, or they don't come back for a large number of years. And so there's something about that experience that's not very good. And so we've been engaged in a lot of focus grouping, trying to talk to people, get feedback. There's all sorts of, kiosk activity in how did you? We've gone electronic with the donor screening in the clinics, and then we've been assessing people's reactions to that by actually asking questions after you've done your donation, and you're sitting there waiting, drinking your juice and cookies. We're chasing you around with surveys. We're really trying to get a better understanding of what our existing donor base doesn't like about what we're doing, and looking at how to fix that. And we, honestly, we're a little bit, I wouldn't say bereft of ideas, but not really with a clear direction about how do we convince that proportion of the Canadian public out there that isn't interested in donating blood that maybe they ought to try it. And that's a very difficult sell. And it's true almost everywhere.
Sorry, can you pass that up? Dan, is there any thought to providing donors with information about their health that they might get in addition to giving, in addition to the cookies and juice, cholesterol screening or blood pressure or something that they could come in for and get? What's the thinking about that?
Yeah, we had made an active decision not to go down the cholesterol testing path, although some of the U.S. blood operators do that. I don't know I don't think you guys do either, but we decided purposefully not to go down there, partly because we have a regulator that's very concerned that we should not be doing anything that is on the edge of practicing medicine, and so that was getting in the gray zone for them. What we've decided to do is, because we are for our donors now, we have a hemoglobin measurement when they come in to donate. For some proportion of our donors, we're doing ferritin testing, and this all goes in our data system, so we can link the profile for the donor when they go online to their own file. They will be able, it's not hooked up yet, we're just running a pilot, but they will be able to see their hemoglobin levels and their ferritin tests. So they'll be able to see their lab results from anything that we've done on them. And that's about as far as we've gotten in terms of providing people with that kind of information. We really want our donors to start thinking harder about their own iron management.
You don't give them iron pills?
No, we don't. And that goes over the border for our regulator right now about that is the practice of medicine if we hand out pills. I think we have to do something. And that's a discussion we have to go have with the regulator. Yeah.
So I have many patients in my practice with hereditary hemochromatosis. And I know this is an issue that you guys have probably thought about, but that's a potential donor pool that in their induction phase, are getting phlebotomies every week or 2 weeks, and that blood's just being thrown away when we're doing it in the hospital day unit. So is there any way to, right now the minimum donation period is every 56 days. Is there any way to, make exceptions for those individuals? And I know, it's not exactly altruistic for them, right? Because they have an agenda too. They're improving their health by donating, but.
Yeah, our challenge there has been that we don't have a way within our existing computerized screening system to allow that kind of exception. So we had one low-grade conversation with Health Canada about that. They weren't that keen about more frequent than 56 days, and we've actually just made the decision that's going to go in the opposite direction of that, which is women can only donate once every 84 days now. So, yeah.
Hi, Dane. That was a really informative talk. I was actually curious about your cell therapy program in Canada. So, as you know, being part of Blood Systems, we've tried to embark upon a cell production program, and we've definitely had our ups and downs in trying to figure out how invested we should be in it, how much it's going to cost. And including areas such as, clean room facilities, which I think are definitely required for it. It's almost, it almost would be impossible to actually, set up a effective, productive program without that. Are those part here in Canada? Are those clean rooms that you have, are they part of the blood centers? I mean,
So they're not. They're not part of the blood centers. They're all sitting in academic teaching hospital space pretty much. And so I don't know if Jamie's still here, but the CellNet program that he was referring to right at the end, and he had a little map of Canada with people's faces on it, those have significant clean room facilities in each of those locations.
And
so
you have the ability to actually go in and utilize these sort of setups in partnership with the...
It's possible. We haven't actually explored that yet. We have had some of them come to us to say, can you help us figure out how to get through the regulatory pathways, because they can't believe how many forms there are to fill out, that sort of thing.
And that's where really the blood centers are ideally suited. I mean, they know this stuff
That's
inside
right.
out. I mean, so there is potential for partnership.
Yeah.
It just, we haven't figured it out yet.
No, and that's
Maybe
really
you will.
what we've been talking about is, like, we have a limited partnership with the Ottawa Hospital around some areas in their cellular therapies program, but we haven't really tried to build it in a strategic way for the rest of the country. It's just under discussion. It's one of the reasons we were chasing you to come to Ottawa. So. We thought you had all the answers, Shabani.
So, Dana, I've just been thinking about your slide with doing too little and doing too much and the cost. But politically, can you ever strive for anything other than zero risk, whatever the price? Because as soon as you start sacrificing lives, you get into another royal inquiry and everything.
Yeah, but I mean, I could say it's really it's the risk assessment that becomes important. So we chose, I'll give Zika as the example, we chose not to do what the Americans did. So the Americans implemented individual donor NAT testing for Zika virus, which is about as intense a response to Zika as you could possibly imagine. I'm sure that the hospital patients in Alaska feel so much safer about their blood program as a result. But what we did was we took a different approach. We said, what is really the risk of transmitting Zika virus through the blood supply in Canada? And we came up with a number that was in excess of 1 in 20 million at the time we did the initial risk assessment. And we said, is it worth investing Canadian taxpayer dollars in something that's going to happen 1 in 20 million times? And we basically said, no.
So would you have a strategy for that one case, if it happened?
We don't. We would deal with it at the time. I mean, we would just basically say, this is the process that was gone through. We decided that this was a risk that was worth accepting. So, yeah. I think the acceptance of risk has changed in the interval between Creever's report and today, and so there's the idea that you would chase endless amounts of money out into those little tiny tails of risk is basically people have realized it's way better to work on the wait list for knees and hips than it is to do that. Thank you.
So I get to wrap up. Before I do, hold on. Yeah. So first, I'm just the stander here. Really, this entire symposium was organized by Dana. She did the invitations and the organizations, and she did this mostly on an airplane, I think. So we really appreciate it, and I really want to thank her for all the work. Clearly, we've gone from the future back to the future today, and it's been really a credit to wonderful speakers, really exceptional and stimulating and engaging, and everybody's here still, which is really quite unique, and I'm not sure if that's because there's beer at the end or because you have been really engaged, but I'll take it that everybody was thrilled by all the speakers. And many thanks to all of you, then, the speakers and the attendees, and particularly Hannah and Anna, the mic runners, and the judges. And to that, I do have some awards to give. For best posters. So, third place in the list of posters is Inoli de Silva. Inoli? Are you here? There you go. Second place, Brian Lynn. And first, drumroll, ML Islamazan. ML? Where are you? Okay, with that, I call this symposium to an end, except for the beer, drinks, and some cheese and crackers. Okay? Thank you very much for coming.